Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It started with a question. A simple, disorienting question that I couldn't shake off. Why am I not in any of these pictures? I had been going through some old family albums when I came across a collection of photographs that made my skin crawl. They were yellowed with age, some edges tattered from years of handling. But it wasn't the state of the photos that unsettled me. It was the fact that I wasn't in them. At least, not in the way I should have been. I had been sorting through the attic, the musty air heavy around me, trying to distract myself from the pressure of my own thoughts. The house was silent. Too silent, almost. The kind of silence that made you feel like someone was watching. I wasn't used to being alone here. My family had long since moved away, and now the house stood empty, its creaking walls and dim corners serving as reminders of what was, or maybe what had been. I flipped through the old photo album, each page turning slowly, as if the album itself didn't want to be opened. The pictures were of family events, holidays, birthdays, happy moments, as far as I could tell. But there was something off. I didn't recognize the people in the photos the way I should have. Faces blurred, their expressions just a little too wrong. But it wasn't just that. There were moments where people were standing together, smiling, celebrating, but in the background, on the edges of these images, there were things I couldn't explain. Figures, faintly visible, caught in the blur between reality and something else. People or things that shouldn't have been there. And none of them, not a single one, were familiar to me. I blinked. My heart skipped a beat as my mind raced. What was happening? Why couldn't I remember being there? How was it possible that I was missing from every family picture? At first, I told myself it was a trick of the light. Old photos, aged film, and overexposure could easily make faces look odd. Shadows could play tricks on the mind. Maybe that was all this was. But as I looked closer, the unease inside me only grew. One picture showed my parents at a party, smiling in front of a Christmas tree, but there, just behind my mother's shoulder, was something else, a shadow, thick and dark, standing just out of focus. It didn't look like a person, not quite. It was as if it were something trying to be human but failing. I slammed the album shut, but even as I did, my mind kept wandering back to that photo. The figures in the background seemed to be watching me now, even in my thoughts. They weren't just shadows, they felt alive. I could almost hear them, whispering through the static in my head. The silence in the house was thick now, oppressive. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was slowly closing in around me. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound, barely perceptible, like the rustle of footsteps. I was certain someone was here with me. But how could that be? I was alone. Weren't I? I stood up abruptly, my legs feeling unsteady, like they might give way under me. The attic suddenly felt too small, too confining. I needed to get out of here. I needed to breathe. As I moved toward the stairs, I thought I heard the distinct sound of someone breathing behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Just the lingering dust, the dim light filtering in through the single attic window. I felt a strange compulsion to go back to the album, to look at the photos again. But I didn't want to. I couldn't. The first image was a family picnic. A happy moment, at least it should have been. But in the background of the photo, a figure stood near a tree. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. It was different. I blinked. I didn't know what it was. It looked like it was reaching for something. Then I heard it. A soft creak behind me, followed by a faint whisper of a voice. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. There was no explanation for this. It couldn't be real. But as I looked back at the photo, I saw something else, a tiny, almost imperceptible detail. My face. It was there, too. A shadow, just barely visible, as though I had been in the photo all along, but had somehow faded, erased by something I couldn't understand. I stepped back from the album, my hands trembling, my heart racing in my chest. The shadows in the photos seemed to grow longer, more defined. I knew, then, that I wasn't imagining things. Something was in those photos. And whatever it was connected to me in ways I didn't understand. The house was no longer quiet. The sounds around me seemed to grow louder, the creaking floorboards beneath my feet, the rustling in the walls, the faint hum of the air conditioning kicking on in the distance. Everything felt wrong, and I couldn't tell where the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. I needed answers. I had to know what was happening. But deep down, I feared what I might uncover. The rest of the house seemed to grow darker, as though the shadows themselves were closing in. The only thing that was clear was that I couldn't escape whatever had followed me here. Whatever had been watching me from those pictures. And I had no idea how to stop it. I couldn't escape the images. The faces, if you could even call them that, stayed with me. They lingered in my mind, their vacant expressions haunting my every thought. I felt them watching me, even when I closed my eyes. The unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach deepened, morphing into something more urgent, more suffocating. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening to me, or else I would lose my mind. The shadows from the photos seemed to stretch out into the corners of the room, their presence palpable, like a thick fog that choked the air. I paced the attic, hoping for some rational explanation, but there was none. No logical reason I could point to. Just the increasing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The photos, they were the key, I realized. I couldn't shake the feeling that they held some hidden truth, some message, something I hadn't seen before. But what could that be? I went back to the photo album, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. Each photograph seemed more unnerving than the last, each one more foreign. The faces I should have recognized were there, but so were the figures, those fleeting, shadowy beings at the edges. The longer I stared, the more they seemed to move, to shift, as if they were becoming real. Alive. I ran my fingers over the next photo, a family reunion at a park. People in the foreground were laughing, a warm summer day frozen in time. But in the background, just behind a row of bushes, there was something else. A figure that didn't belong. It was too tall, its limbs too long. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was distorted like a melted mask. I jerked my hand away from the album, feeling my pulse race in my neck. I wasn't alone in this house. I heard it again, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. A breath. My own breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the thudding in my ears louder than the silence of the attic. I had to go downstairs. I needed to get out of this room, away from the suffocating presence that seemed to be closing in on me. I made my way toward the attic stairs, but as I reached the top step, I froze. There, at the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. A shadow. It stood motionless, almost like it was waiting for me. It was tall, far taller than any person could be, its shape wrong, too thin, its arms elongated and twisting in unnatural ways. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, its presence radiating through the air like a force I couldn't explain. The edges of its form seemed to flicker, as if it were caught between two worlds. I didn't breathe. It was as if the air had thickened around me, becoming heavy and cold. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked and it vanished. I stumbled back from the stairs, my body trembling. My mind raced, but the thoughts came too quickly, too confused. What had I just seen? Had it been real? Or was it some trick of the light? Some kind of psychological break? I couldn't tell anymore. My grip on reality was slipping, unraveling with each passing second. I backed away from the stairs, feeling the floorboards creak under my weight. I needed to get out of here, but a part of me felt like I was being pulled deeper into the house, into whatever had followed me here. I went back into the room, the photo album still open on the floor where I had left it. I kneeled down, my hand shaking as I reached for the next page. This time, the photo was different. It wasn't a family gathering, not a holiday. It was a picture of a room, an old room, dark and empty, but somehow familiar. The details in the background were fuzzy, the lighting poor, but one thing stood out. A mirror, cracked and covered in dust, reflected a distorted shape. Something, or someone, stood just out of view. I felt a sudden pain in my chest. It was the same mirror I had in the hallway. The same room. This wasn't just a picture. It was a warning. My heart raced as I looked around the room. I had to get out. Now. But the door behind me slammed shut, the loud bang making me jump. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the echo of the door's crash reverberating in the empty house. I didn't have time to think. The photos, the shadow, the mirror, they were all connected somehow. I had to confront whatever was lurking here, whatever was hidden behind the veil of this house. But I wasn't sure I could survive it. The door was shut. Locked, maybe. I didn't know. All I could hear was the deafening silence that followed, settling like dust in the corners of the room. My chest tightened, and I could feel the air grow thicker, colder. The house seemed to be holding its breath. I turned to face the mirror again, the same one from the photo. It was there, in the corner of the room, reflecting the dim light from the single bulb above. The mirror was cracked, the fractures spreading like veins through the glass, distorting the world around it. But now, it felt different. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The room around me grew darker, the edges of my vision blurring, until all that remained was the mirror. I stepped closer, drawn to it, despite the cold sweat gathering on my skin. My reflection flickered. The familiar image of myself, my tired eyes and disheveled hair, seemed to melt and warp as though something else was behind it, something that didn't belong. A shadow passed over the glass, but when I blinked, it was gone. I leaned in, my breath fogging up the cracked surface, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. The mirror didn't just reflect me. It reflected something else, something I couldn't understand, something beyond the simple reflection of the room. A flicker. A movement. A face. No, not a face. But something that looked wrong. It was barely there at first, just a shadow shifting behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. I jerked back toward the mirror, heart hammering in my chest. My reflection was changing. It was like I was no longer alone in the glass. There were others in the mirror with me, figures moving just out of my view, shifting in ways they shouldn't. My own reflection was trembling, the image in the glass warping and distorting as if trying to escape. But the figures in the background, the ones I hadn't noticed before, moved closer. Their features were still unclear, their forms blending with the shadows, but now they were unmistakably there, watching me. I stumbled back, but the reflection in the mirror didn't follow me. It stood still, but the shadows in the background were closing in on my image, suffocating it. I couldn't breathe. I backed away, stumbling over the floorboards, my hands shaking violently. The house felt suffocating now, like the walls themselves were closing in. The photos, the shadow at the bottom of the stairs, the mirror, it was all connected. Every part of it, every detail, pointed to something I couldn't escape. Then I heard it again. That whisper. Faint, at first, like the rustle of fabric in the distance. But this time, it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice. It wasn't speaking words. Not exactly. But I could hear it, feel it, like a pressure in my skull, pushing against my thoughts. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew one thing for sure. It was coming from the mirror. I turned away from it, heart racing, my mind scrambling for a way out. The door, why hadn't I thought of it before? I moved quickly toward it, but the floorboards creaked under my feet as if something was following me. The air was thick, like the house was alive, watching me, breathing with me. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand froze before I could touch it. Something was there, on the other side. I could feel it. A pressure, heavy and thick. It pressed against the door like a body waiting to push through. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. But I didn't know where to go. Every part of the house felt wrong now. Every shadow seemed to hold something waiting for me. There was no escape. The whisper grew louder. I spun back toward the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. The reflection, my reflection, was no longer just a reflection. It was alive. It was moving, not like me, but like it had a mind of its own. The figure in the glass smiled. But it wasn't my smile. It was something else, something cold and knowing. Its eyes gleamed with a dark, empty hunger. I screamed and stumbled backward, falling to the ground. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision swimming. But as I looked up, I saw it. It was moving toward me. The shadow behind the glass was coming out of the mirror. It was happening. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, but the room seemed to stretch, pulling me back toward the mirror. The door wouldn't open. The walls were closing in. The whisper, the breathing, the shadows, they were all around me, suffocating, consuming me. And then I felt it. A cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I was already lost. The cold hand on my shoulder sent a jolt of electricity through my body, freezing me in place. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I could feel it, whatever it was, looming behind me. Its presence was overwhelming, like the weight of an entire ocean pressing down on my chest. The hand wasn't real, not in the way I understood reality, but I could feel it, as though it were an extension of the very air around me, thick with something ancient and malevolent. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt dry, choked with fear. I couldn't turn around. Not now. Not when every instinct in my body screamed that if I looked, I would see something worse than I could ever imagine. The room seemed to close in even tighter, the air growing colder with every passing second. The floor beneath me groaned, and the sound of the whisper grew louder, clearer, as though it were circling my mind, drowning out everything else. It wasn't speaking words anymore, it was feeling. It was emotion, raw and alien, flooding my thoughts. I felt something shift beside me, almost like a shift in the very fabric of the room, and then the whisper grew sharper, almost desperate, pulling at the edges of my sanity. It wanted me to listen, but I couldn't. I couldn't process it. My mind was unraveling. Finally, with an effort that felt like fighting against the weight of the world, I forced myself to turn around. Slowly, inch by inch, my body trembling, I dared to look. The space behind me was empty. Nothing. No one. Just the cold shadows of the room, stretching toward me like fingers. I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion, the terror still gnawing at the edges of my mind. It had been so real. So tangible. But now, it was gone. Was it ever really there? Or had it been a trick of my mind? I backed away, toward the window. I had to leave. I had to get out of here, away from this house, away from whatever was reaching out to me. I turned to the window, but when I looked out, I saw nothing but blackness. The night had consumed everything. The streetlights, the trees, the path, I couldn't see a thing. The cold hand was back. Only this time, it was at my wrist. It gripped me with an unyielding force, tightening as if trying to drag me back into the depths of the house. I jerked away, but the grip was too strong. It pulled me toward the mirror. The mirror. I realized, with sudden clarity, that it wasn't just a reflection. It was a portal. A window into something far worse than the world I knew. And it was pulling me in. I struggled, panic rising in my chest as I fought against the invisible force. My skin felt like it was burning, the air thick with the pressure of something ancient and relentless, something that had been waiting for this moment. And then, the mirror began to crack. It wasn't like the cracks I had seen before, the fractured, surface-level damage. No, this was something deeper. The glass splintered, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The reflection in the mirror shifted, the shadows growing, taking on a life of their own. They didn't just shift. They moved, they slithered toward me, twisting and contorting in ways that defied all logic. I reached out toward the mirror, as if trying to stop it from swallowing me whole, but my hand didn't feel real anymore. It was as if it wasn't mine at all. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the room. It wasn't my voice. The scream was full of agony, of terror so pure it sent a ripple of cold through my spine. It was coming from the mirror. And then I saw it. A face. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. But it was there, distorted, twisted beyond recognition, its eyes wide and full of an unspoken horror. It was pleading, crying out for something. For help. For escape. For something to end the nightmare. And just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The mirror cracked again, the sound echoing in my ears like the breaking of bones. My reflection was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me closer to the glass. I tried to step back, but the force grew stronger, like invisible hands clawing at my skin. The room around me spun, everything warping and distorting. I saw flashes of faces in the cracks of the mirror, faces I didn't recognize, their eyes wide and hollow, staring at me from a place beyond the glass. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. I was being pulled in. Just as my fingertips brushed the cold surface of the mirror, everything went black. I woke up to silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, but one you find in the deep of night or when you're alone with your thoughts. No. This was an unnatural, suffocating quiet, the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. It was like the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I sat up. The air was thick, colder than before, and the room around me was unfamiliar. It wasn't the same room I had been in, at least, not entirely. The walls were now a shade of deep gray, the floor beneath me cracked and uneven. The mirror, the one I had been drawn to, was gone. But the feeling, it lingered. That presence, that weight, still hung in the air like a dark cloud. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and looked around. The house felt wrong. No matter where I turned, the shadows seemed to stretch too far, as if they were alive, watching, waiting. I reached for the door, but as soon as my hand touched the knob, the whisper came back. Faint at first, like a breeze, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was inside my head. You shouldn't have come back. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I turned toward the source, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the darkness stretching before me. My breath caught in my throat. I was still here. Still trapped. The room felt like it was closing in again, the walls bending, the floor shifting beneath me. The light above flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance and twist in impossible ways. Every corner of the room felt alive, as though it had become a part of whatever was pulling me in. Then, a sound. Soft at first, but unmistakable. A faint creak. I turned toward it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was coming from the far side of the room, just beyond the doorway. The same place where the mirror had been. I didn't want to go closer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever was there. But I couldn't. My feet were already moving, and my body seemed to move of its own accord. As I stepped forward, the door creaked open. Slowly. Reluctantly. And then, I saw it. The mirror. It was back. But it wasn't the same as before. The glass was cracked beyond recognition, shattered into 1,000 shards that seemed to move on their own. They shifted, rearranged themselves, forming a new reflection. A distorted version of the room I was standing in. And in the center of that reflection, I saw something, or someone. It was me. But it wasn't. The figure in the mirror was twisted, like a mockery of my own image. My face was hollow, eyes wide with terror, but there was something else in the reflection. Something standing behind me. A figure, so tall it seemed to stretch to the ceiling, its features blurry and indistinct, but I could feel its presence, like an ominous shadow looming just out of sight. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as I realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison. A place where the past and present collided, where reality bent and twisted to something darker. It had been waiting for me, watching me, drawing me in. And now I was part of it. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the mirror seemed to pull me in. The figure behind me moved, its shape flickering like a broken image, and then the reflection spoke. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling. A cold, oppressive pressure on my mind, as if it were trying to force its way into my thoughts. "It's too late," the reflection whispered. "You're one of us now." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in front of me. I couldn't escape. The walls pressed in, and the mirror was watching, waiting. I could hear it, the soft creak of its glass, like it was breathing, alive. And then I understood. I was never meant to leave. This house, this place, it didn't just trap people. It kept them. For eternity. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence that surrounded me. The mirror's reflection stared back at me, my own distorted face twisted into a grotesque smile, and the shadows behind it began to move, reaching toward me, pulling me into the darkness. And as I was dragged into the glass, I felt it. The cold. The suffocating, unbearable cold. I was no longer in the room. I was part of the reflection now. A part of whatever haunted this place. And somewhere, deep inside, I realized with a chilling certainty this wasn't the end. It had only just begun. It started with a question I couldn't shake. Why did I feel like I had been here before? I had never been to this town. Never even heard of it until I stumbled upon a map hidden deep in the drawer of an old, neglected desk in the hotel room where I was staying. It wasn't a fancy map, just a simple, worn piece of paper. But something about it felt wrong. The map was marked with strange symbols. Red circles, scribbled X's, and lines that intersected at odd angles. At first, I thought it might be an old tourist guide or something left behind by previous guests. But as I scanned it, something caught my eye. The locations marked on the map, they weren't just places. They were events. Solemn dates were written in tiny letters next to each point, some too faded to read clearly. Others, though, I recognized them. I couldn't explain how, but I knew. One spot, marked with a jagged X, was labeled with a date that I couldn't forget. It was the day of my father's accident. I had been a child then, too young to fully understand the significance, but the memory of that day, the car crash, the blood, the silence, was burned into my mind. Another marked location was a tiny cabin on the outskirts of town. The date next to it. I remembered. It was the day my best friend disappeared. No one ever found her, not a trace, not a single clue. I thought I had forgotten, but seeing that name again, it was as if I could hear her voice calling me, asking me to look for her. I shook my head. This was insane. I was simply overreacting to something I didn't understand. But the pull, the weight of the map, was undeniable. I had to find out more. So, I decided to follow it. I began with the nearest marked location, the one closest to where I was staying. It wasn't hard to find, the streets matched the ones on the map, and the old, decaying house was still standing, despite the years. There was a strange smell in the air, like something had rotted long ago, yet the place was still. I walked up to the front door, half expecting it to creak open, but it didn't. Everything was still. There was a thick, unsettling silence around me. Then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was the sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, almost imperceptible. I froze. Someone was there. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but no one was there. The street was empty. The silence returned. Was it my imagination? Had I been here too long, letting the fear get the best of me? I didn't know, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. Not before I knew the truth. The map was the key. I just had to keep looking. Each marked location felt like a clue, a breadcrumb trail leading me towards something. Something I couldn't explain. But as I walked further into the town, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The world around me felt warped, like I was moving through an echo of reality. Buildings looked slightly off, the shadows stretched in strange directions, and the sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I reached another point on the map. The name of the street matched, but something was wrong. The house I had been looking for wasn't the one in the drawing. It was the same house, but it was wrong. The windows were shattered, the door was slightly ajar, and the entire place looked as if it had been abandoned for years. Yet, there was something new in the air, a sense of foreboding. A chill. I walked inside. And then, it hit me. The map wasn't just marking places. It was marking events, things that had happened. But I wasn't sure anymore if they were memories or predictions. The walls of the house were covered in photographs. Old, yellowed images of people I didn't recognize. At first, I thought they were random. But then, I saw it. A familiar face standing in the background of a picture. A face I had seen only once. It was mine. I stepped back, heart racing. How? How could this be? Why was I here? I tried to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to face the room, and everything around me began to warp. The photos on the wall started to change, twisting and shifting, becoming darker, more distorted. I saw images of myself, as a child, walking toward a road where the accident had happened. Another photo of me standing in front of my missing friend's house. And then there was a photo of the cabin. It was dark, and the shadows inside seemed to move. I couldn't escape. The room seemed to close in, the walls shifting closer and closer. And then, the sound. A whisper. A voice that came from everywhere. You shouldn't have come. I turned in every direction, but the voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The floor beneath me began to crack, and the map in my hands began to burn. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if this was real. But the feeling, the suffocating sense that something was playing with me, controlling me, was overwhelming. I was no longer just looking at the map. I was trapped inside it. The walls seemed to stretch and pulse as if the house itself was alive, suffocating me with its unrelenting grip. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence closing in, something beyond my comprehension. I tried to step back, but the floor beneath me gave way with a sickening groan. I stumbled, my heart pounding in my chest, and my hand desperately searched for anything to hold on to. The room was warping, the edges of the walls blurring into a dark, swirling abyss. The photographs on the wall no longer seemed like memories. They were traps. I could see myself, but not as I remembered. In one photo, I was standing in front of a familiar street corner, my father's accident. In another, I was walking down the very road where my friend had disappeared, as if I had known the exact moment when she would vanish. Stop, I whispered to myself. trying to hold on to my sanity. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But that voice, whispered again, its words cutting through the fog of confusion. You can't escape. I slammed my hand against the wall, trying to break free from whatever was controlling me, but the map in my grip burned hotter. My skin tingled as though the ink was searing into my flesh. I pulled it away, but the map was stuck, almost as if it had fused to my hand. I could no longer see the streets or the markings. All that was left was the feeling of impending doom, the sense that everything was familiar, yet wrong. I staggered backwards, the map still seared to my palm. The door behind me cracked open with an unnatural creak, and before I could stop myself, I stumbled through it. The world outside the house felt different. It was darker, and the town seemed to have shifted. The buildings loomed unnaturally tall, casting long shadows across the street. The sky had taken on an unsettling gray hue, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. I wanted to run. I needed to escape. But the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me was overwhelming. The air felt thick, as if it carried the weight of unspoken threats, secrets hidden beneath every turn of the corner. I looked at the map, now partially disintegrated from the burn but still somehow intact. The marks had grown darker, more vivid, like they were alive, like they knew I was here. The first marked point, the one with my father's accident, was still visible. It wasn't far from where I stood now. I had to go there. I didn't know why, but it felt like the next step, like the town was pushing me forward, like the past had caught up to me, forcing me into something I couldn't escape. I followed the street signs, each step heavier than the last. The houses around me were eerily quiet. Not a single person. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting. And then I saw it. The corner. The very one where my father's car had crashed all those years ago. The memories flooded back, his face, pale and lifeless. The sound of sirens. The chaos. But this was different. This corner felt off. There was no sign of the crash, no remnants of the past. Everything was too perfect, too still. The shadows seemed to gather around the corner, casting an unnatural gloom. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer. The map in my hand began to hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was calling to me, urging me forward. I turned to look at the street sign, but it was different now. It no longer read Main Street. Instead, it read End of the Road. The words felt like a warning, but I ignored them. I had to keep going. The next marked location was close. I could feel it. I walked past the corner, and suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. I was no longer on a street. I was standing at the edge of a forest. The trees were dark and twisted, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness. No wind. No birds. Just silence. The map started to pulse again, this time stronger. The place had changed. The air had changed. It was all beginning to feel too real, too familiar. I glanced at the map one last time, and the next marked point was clear, the cabin. The cabin from my childhood. The one I had been told to stay away from. The one where my friend disappeared. The place where I was supposed to go next. I could hear the voice again, soft but clear. Tom. And despite every ounce of logic screaming at me to turn back, I walked toward the trees. As I crossed the threshold of the forest, I realized there was no turning back anymore. The town was no longer a place I could leave. It had already wrapped its fingers around my past. It knew me too well. And as I walked deeper into the shadows, I couldn't help but feel one thing. I was no longer searching for answers. I was running from them. The forest closed in around me, its dark trees pressing together like walls. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth, and each breath felt like I was inhaling the weight of the past. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, yet the silence of the woods was deafening. The map pulsed against my skin again, each throb in time with my heartbeat. It was more than just an object now. It was a tether, pulling me further into the unknown, as if it had a will of its own. I glanced at it, but the markings had changed once more. They seemed to dance in the dim light, as if mocking me, reminding me that there was no escape from whatever was unfolding. The trees parted briefly, revealing a small clearing. In the center stood the cabin. It was as if it had always been here, waiting for me. The structure was old, crumbling at the edges, but still standing. Its windows were dark, reflecting no light, as though they had been sealed shut long ago. I stopped just outside the clearing, a wave of unease crashing over me. I had seen this cabin before, in my dreams, in the photos, in the stories my parents told me to forget. The place where everything had started. I could almost hear the whispers now, faint, like a distant memory trying to resurface. "Go in," the voice urged, and against my better judgment, I took a step forward. As I approached the door, the air grew colder. The wood creaked beneath my feet, groaning as if it were alive, protesting my presence. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was inside. But I had to. I had come too far to turn back now. I twisted the knob, and the door opened with a sound that made my skin crawl. The inside was exactly as I remembered from my childhood, dark, musty, and forgotten. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and dust layered everything like a shroud. There was a sense of stillness, as if time had stopped the moment I stepped inside. But something was different. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. As if they were moving, shifting, watching me. I stepped in, my breath catching in my throat. The map began to vibrate violently in my hand, almost as though it were alive. I stared at it, and the markings blurred, rearranged, and reappeared. The new marking was close. It was on the far wall, just beyond the old, decaying fireplace. I felt drawn to it. My legs moved on their own, as though they had already made the decision for me. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thicker, the shadows pressing closer. When I reached the wall, I saw it. A large, faded stain that seemed to have been there for years, but it wasn't just any stain. It was a shape. A handprint. A bloody handprint. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, rough surface. The moment my skin touched the stain, the room seemed to shift. The floor groaned beneath me, the walls pulsing like they were breathing. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, faint but growing louder. Slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was in the cabin with me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The shadows had deepened, pooling in the corners like liquid darkness. My pulse quickened, and the map burned against my skin once again, pulling me toward the back door. I had to leave. I had to get out. But I couldn't. I was trapped. The cabin, the town, the map, it was all a web, and I was caught in the center. I backed toward the door, my eyes never leaving the shadows. The footsteps continued, now unmistakable, closer. They were moving around the cabin, circling me. It's time. The voice came from everywhere, vibrating in the very air. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was as if the cabin itself was speaking, alive with some malevolent force. The shadows seemed to grow, creeping toward me like fingers. I glanced at the map one last time. The next marked location was the well. I knew where it was. It was near the edge of the forest. A well I had visited as a child. The place where I had found something that I had buried in my memory until now. The footsteps stopped. The shadows froze. Tum. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran for the door, but as soon as I stepped through it, the world outside was no longer the one I recognized. The cabin was gone, replaced by a vast, empty field. The trees from the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, as if they were closing in on me. I looked down, and there it was, right at my feet, the well. The one I had buried all those memories in. I could feel the pull again, stronger than before. The map burned against my palm, as if it were urging me to take the final step. To open the well, to see what I had left behind. But a part of me was already screaming. I didn't want to know. I couldn't. But there was no choice now. I had to go on. The well called to me, and I answered. I took my first step forward. The ground beneath me shifted again. This time, it wasn't the earth that trembled. It was the world itself. And I realized with chilling certainty that I was no longer the one in control. The map had already decided. And I was just following. I stood at the edge of the well, the world around me unnervingly still. The wind had stopped, the trees no longer whispered their secrets, and even the sky above seemed to hold its breath. The well, dark and foreboding, stared back at me like a mouth ready to swallow everything in its path. My pulse thudded in my ears, matching the rhythm of my steps as I inched closer. The map was still in my hand, burning with that strange heat. The markings had shifted once more, now focused entirely on the well. The point where everything would converge. The final place. The ending. But what was I supposed to find here? What had I buried in my past that was so important, so dangerous, that the map, and now the well, were calling me back to it? I felt as though I was standing on the precipice of something vast and terrible, something I couldn't fully comprehend. I knelt at the edge, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness within the well was impenetrable. I could see nothing. Only the faintest echo of a distant memory seemed to stir within its depths. Go on, the voice from before whispered again, but this time it didn't come from around me, it came from inside my own mind. It was mine, but it wasn't. It was cold, distant, and filled with a sense of inevitability. I hesitated for just a moment longer. And then, my hands trembled as I reached down and untied the rope that lay coiled beside the well. It felt heavy, like an anchor tied to my past. With a deep breath, I tossed the rope into the well. It disappeared with a faint echo, swallowed by the darkness below. For a second, there was nothing. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. Then came the noise. A soft scratching. Faint at first. But it grew louder, sharper, like something, or someone, was crawling up from the depths of the earth. My heart raced. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey. The well had already claimed me. I was trapped, waiting. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft thud. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the dark hole in front of me, but the world around me seemed to blur. The sound of my breathing was the only thing I could hear, each breath a desperate attempt to calm the rising panic within me. And then, a voice. Low and guttural. Come closer. I leaned forward, my eyes straining against the darkness, trying to see what was in the depths. But all I could see was the endless black. The words echoed again, not in my ears, but inside my skull, reverberating like a painful memory I couldn't erase. Come closer. I stepped back, my heart hammering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I wanted to run, to get away from this cursed place. But the map in my hand burned even hotter, and I knew I couldn't leave. Not until I found the answer. I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I lowered my gaze again to the well, my eyes following the faint outline of the rope I had thrown in. It trembled in the darkness, as if it, too, were alive. Another thud. A heavier sound this time. The rope jerked, pulling taut. And then something emerged. It was a hand. Thin, pale, with long, jagged nails that scraped against the stone as it climbed out of the well. The fingers curled around the edge, and I could see the skin stretching tight over the bones as if it had been waiting here for an eternity. My stomach churned. The air grew cold, the darkness deepened, and for the first time, I realized that I wasn't alone. The thing wasn't just coming from the well, it was coming for me. A second hand followed, then a third, each one more skeletal and grotesque than the last. The figure began to emerge, its shape slowly becoming more defined as it pulled itself free from the depths. I could see it now, its face, twisted and contorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into mine. Its skin was decayed, hanging from its bones like wet rags. It smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only malice. The map was now burning my skin. The heat was unbearable, and I wanted to throw it away, but it was like it was fused to my palm. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The thing was almost out of the well now, and its gaze never left me. It was coming closer, its twisted limbs reaching for me. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, jagged and rotten. Come, it whispered, its voice crawling through my mind like 1,000 insects. It's time for you to remember. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to know what it wanted from me. But the map was burning, and I knew I had no choice. The truth, the thing I had buried all those years ago, was coming for me. With a final, desperate effort, I yanked my hand away from the map, throwing it into the well. But it didn't disappear. The map, instead, seemed to disintegrate into smoke, swirling around the creature's head like a storm. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing my skin. And in that moment, everything came rushing back. I remembered the accident. I remembered the night it all started, the night my brother had disappeared. The night I had made the decision that had led me here. The thing in front of me wasn't some monster. It was me. It was the thing I had become, the thing I had buried deep within myself, trying to forget. And now, it had found me. The well was no longer just a well. It was a mirror, and I was staring into it, face to face with the consequences of everything I had done. The past had come alive, and there was no escaping it. I had to face it. But I didn't know if I was strong enough. The creature's grip tightened around my wrist, cold and unyielding. Its fingers dug into my skin, sending a sharp wave of panic through me. The darkness around us pressed in, suffocating and thick, as if the world itself had vanished and only this moment remained. Its face was still locked in that twisted smile, its hollow eyes piercing into mine. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away, but I couldn't stop myself. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, bound to this moment, to this creature that had once been a part of me. Remember, it whispered again, its voice a dry rasp, full of malice. You can't escape what you are. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. I could feel the weight of the past crushing me, forcing me to confront the darkness I had buried long ago. I had thought I could move past it, could outrun it. But here it was, standing before me, reminding me of the truth I had tried to forget. I didn't mean for this to happen, I gasped, my voice barely a whisper, shaking with terror. Please, let go of me. But the thing didn't answer. Instead, it just kept staring at me, its jagged teeth glinting in the pale light that had begun to spill from the well's depths. The rope had disappeared, the well now a gaping maw, pulling in everything, time, reality, and my very soul. I can't, it murmured, and this time, the words weren't just a command. They were an accusation. I remembered it all now, the accident, my brother, the choices I made that night. It was my fault. I had been the one driving. I had been the one who had turned too quickly, who had pushed the car too hard. I had thought I could control it, thought I could fix it. But I couldn't. And now, here I was, face to face with the consequences of my actions, the thing I had tried so desperately to deny. The creature leaned in closer, its breath cold and fetid against my skin. You think you can run from it, it said softly. But you'll never escape. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe, to think. My mind raced, but it felt like it was moving through molasses. Every part of me was frozen, by fear, by guilt, by the weight of everything I had done. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't just stand there, unable to move, unable to fight back. I had to do something. I had to reclaim control, no matter the cost. With every ounce of strength I had left, I yanked my arm free from the creature's grip. The thing shrieked in fury, its claws leaving deep gouges in my skin, but I didn't stop. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady beneath me, my heart still pounding in my ears. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The ground beneath me seemed to shift and twist, like the earth itself was conspiring to keep me in this nightmare. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had already faced the truth. I had already seen the thing I had become. The path before me twisted and turned, a blur of shapes and shadows. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself faster, harder. But the sound of footsteps behind me, the sound of something chasing me, grew louder and louder. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that now. But as I rounded the bend, something strange happened. The world began to blur again, the sounds and shapes melting together. And then, suddenly, I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't anywhere. I was back at the well. My knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The creature was gone. The well was just a well, still and silent. But everything had changed. The map, the markings, the well, they had all been part of this twisted cycle, this never-ending loop. And I was right back where I had started. But this time, there was no escaping. I had faced the truth. I had faced myself, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. The wind whispered again, faint and cold. The shadows shifted, stretching out across the earth, as if they, too, were waiting for something. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, the weight of what had been, and the shadow of what was to come. The reckoning had come, and there was no going back. The past was here, alive, and it wasn't going anywhere. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow across the dark room. It was an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before answering. Hello? A pause, then a voice, calm, smooth, almost too calm. I can help you, the voice said, as though it had been waiting for me to pick up. I frowned, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Who is this? The voice chuckled lightly, the sound echoing unnervingly in the silence of my room. That's not important. What matters is that I know what you're going through, and I can make it stop. I sat up, now fully awake. My mind raced. What was this about? How did this person know anything about me? What do you mean? What are you talking about? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. There was another pause. A soft, almost imperceptible sound came through the phone, a shuffling noise, like someone moving through a room. I know what you're hiding, the voice said again, softer this time, as if it were sharing a secret. I know what you're afraid of, and I can make it go away. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken threat. A chill ran down my spine. This person didn't know anything about me, did they? No one knew my fears. No one could. Who is this? I demanded again, feeling the blood rush to my face. The line went silent. Then, before I could speak again, the voice responded, almost too casually. I'll call you tomorrow. Same time. And just like that, the line went dead. I stood there, holding my phone, staring at the screen. The call had ended as abruptly as it had started. I looked at the number, but it was unlisted. I tried calling it back, but it just rang and rang, with no answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, the phone rang again. I hesitated, but picked it up anyway. The voice on the other end was exactly the same. Calm, reassuring, distant. I see you've been thinking about our conversation, it said. I almost dropped the phone. How did they know? I hadn't told anyone about the call, hadn't mentioned it to a soul. Yet this stranger seemed to know exactly what was happening inside my head. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice thin with barely contained panic. You'll see, the voice replied. But first, you need to know that I'm serious. I can help you, but only if you trust me. I gripped the phone tighter, the cold plastic biting into my palm. Help me with what? I don't need help from anyone. There was a moment of silence before the voice spoke again. You do. You just don't know it yet. Trust me, you will. And then it hung up. Just like the first time. Over the next few days, the calls became more frequent. Sometimes they came in the middle of the day, other times late at night, when the house was still and quiet. The voice never wavered, always calm, always precise. But there was something else now, something underneath the words, something unsettling that I couldn't quite place. The messages began to change. They were no longer vague promises of help. They were more specific, more insistent. "I know about the photograph," the voice said one evening. "The one you keep in your drawer." I froze. My throat tightened. How could they know? There was a photo, just one, tucked away in a drawer in my bedroom. It was from years ago, a memory I tried to bury. A memory I didn't want to think about. I hadn't thought about it in months. But now, hearing those words, I could feel the old fear clawing its way to the surface. "I can make sure that memory never bothers you again," the voice continued, a trace of something dark and cold creeping into the tone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask how they knew about the photo, about the memory. But I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat, just like the lump of fear that had settled deep inside me. The next night, as I sat in my living room, trying to focus on something, anything, to take my mind off the calls, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, just a slight rustling noise, like paper being moved. But it came from the direction of my bedroom. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. No one was supposed to be here. I was alone. Slowly, I walked toward the door of the bedroom. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, just a flicker, in the hallway outside my door. A shape moving too quickly for me to fully see. I froze. I had to be imagining things, I thought. The calls had started to mess with my head, making me paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. With trembling hands, I grabbed the doorknob and slowly turned it. I opened the door a crack, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. Nothing. But then, I noticed it. The photo, the one I had tucked away months ago, was now sitting on my desk, right in the middle of the room. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stepped into the room, my breath shallow, my body trembling. The photo was right there, lying on the desk, face up as though it had been placed there deliberately. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the frame. The familiar image of the old photograph, a picture I had long forgotten, stared back at me. I quickly grabbed it and turned it over, hoping to find some kind of clue, some explanation. But there was nothing. Just the same dull back of the frame. My heart pounded in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me with a loud thud, making me jump. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The silence felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I glanced at the photo again, my mind racing. How could it have moved? How could it have gotten there? Then, I heard it. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing. It was coming from the dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed deeper than usual. I wasn't alone. The air grew colder. My skin prickled with a strange, crawling sensation. I slowly turned my head toward the corner, my hands shaking as I held the photo. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced. It wasn't just a sound now. It was a presence. Something was there. I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the corner. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't take my gaze off of it. The darkness seemed to shift and twist, as though it were alive. Slowly, something began to emerge from the shadows, a figure, tall and thin, draped in darkness, its features obscured by the thick blackness surrounding it. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead, unable to move. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. As it moved closer, the air seemed to grow even colder, the oppressive silence suffocating. "Do you recognize me?" a voice hissed, low and hollow, from the figure. It wasn't the voice I had heard on the phone, but something far more disturbing, like a whisper from the depths of a nightmare. I couldn't respond. My mouth was dry, my mind scrambled. All I could think of was that photo. That damn photo. And how it had somehow brought this thing into my room. The figure stretched out a hand, long, bony fingers reaching toward me. I wanted to run, to flee, but my feet were glued to the floor as though some unseen force was holding me in place. "Your past is mine now," the figure said, its voice growing louder, more insistent, like an echo in a vast, empty space. The words hung in the air, suffocating me, suffusing the room with an unbearable tension. Suddenly, the phone rang again. The harsh sound cut through the stillness like a knife. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to answer, not after everything that had already happened, but my hand moved as if on its own accord, reaching for the phone. I picked it up, my fingers numb. The voice on the other end was the same, but now it sounded different. More menacing. "You see," it said, "I warned you. You can't escape." I swallowed hard, trying to form words, but nothing came. My mind was spinning. Was this real? Or was I losing my mind? The figure in the corner took another step forward, its shadow swallowing the light in the room. It didn't speak anymore, it just stared at me, its eyes gleaming from within the darkness, glowing faintly like embers. I had to do something. Anything. I couldn't just stand there. But the fear, it paralyzed me. "You're not alone," the voice continued, now mocking, cruel. "You've never been alone." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. It knew things about me. Things no one could know. Things I had buried deep inside. I dropped the phone, the sound of it crashing onto the floor echoing in the room. The figure's hand was almost touching my face now, its cold fingers brushing my cheek. I shuddered at the touch, its presence suffocating. "Make it stop," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "Please." But the figure only smiled, if you could call it a smile. The corners of its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. It was getting closer. I had to get out of there. I bolted for the door, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. But just as my hand reached for the knob, I heard the voice again, clearer this time, right behind me. "You're mine now." I yanked open the door and ran down the hallway, not looking back. The floorboards creaked beneath me, and the walls seemed to close in, narrowing with every step I took. The house felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The air itself seemed to press against me, suffocating, making it harder to breathe. I reached the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. They were closing in. Finally, the door opened, and I stepped out into the night, gasping for air, but the sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They followed me into the darkness, relentless and unyielding. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I stood there, my chest heaving, listening to the night around me. Nothing. Not a sound. But I knew it wasn't over. It had just begun. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the photo on my desk. It wasn't just there, it was placed carefully, almost deliberately, as though someone had taken the time to position it in the center of the room for me to find. My pulse raced. How could it have gotten there? I never brought it out. It had been tucked safely away, hidden deep in the drawer for months, and yet here it was, staring back at me in the eerie stillness of the room. I took a step forward, cautiously, as if the room itself might suddenly lunge at me. But nothing moved. It was silent, too silent. The only sound was the thudding of my own heartbeat, so loud in my ears that I almost couldn't hear anything else. I reached the desk and, with trembling hands, picked up the photo. It was the same one, a picture of me with someone I hadn't seen in years. A memory I wished I could forget. We were smiling, happy. But looking at it now, it felt wrong. It felt contaminated. I turned it over, half expecting to find a message scrawled on the back. But there was nothing. Just the faded pencil marks of my old handwriting, the date written on the corner in the corner. I let out a shaky breath. Then, just as I was about to set the photo down and retreat from the room, my phone rang again. The screen flashed an unknown number. I didn't want to answer it, but some part of me knew I had no choice. I picked it up, pressing it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you find the photo?" The voice, cold and familiar, was waiting for me on the other end. I felt the weight of the words press down on me, suffocating me. "How did you?" "I told you, I can help you," the voice interrupted, its tone unyielding. "But you have to trust me. You've already started to see the truth. It's only a matter of time before you understand." My grip on the phone tightened as I tried to steady my breathing. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was a long pause. I could hear something, just faintly, in the background, like a faint echo of movement or maybe a breath. Then, the voice returned, low and insistent. "I want you to stop running from the truth. I want you to stop pretending that nothing's wrong. You can feel it, can't you? The way everything is shifting. The way the walls are closing in." I wanted to scream at the voice, demand answers, but my throat was tight, and my mind felt hazy, clouded by the constant stream of paranoia that seemed to flow through me. I couldn't escape it. "You're losing control, but I can help you regain it," the voice continued, its words like poison seeping into my thoughts. "All you have to do is trust me." I closed my eyes, my mind racing. I had to make sense of this. There had to be a logical explanation, a way out of this madness. But everything felt wrong. Everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers, like I was losing grip on something essential, something real. The voice spoke again, softer now, as if it were coaxing me, leading me into a trap. "I'll be waiting for your next call. And I'll be watching." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, unable to move, unable to speak. The silence was deafening. The following days blurred together. The calls came more frequently, each one leaving me feeling more trapped, more tangled in the web this anonymous stranger was weaving. I couldn't escape the constant fear gnawing at me, pulling me in every direction at once. I tried everything I could think of to block the calls. I changed my number, I blocked unknown callers, I even went as far as turning off my phone entirely for hours on end. But it didn't matter. No matter what I did, the calls kept coming. Each time, the voice was there, calm and patient, as though it were only a matter of time before I would break. I felt like I was being watched at all times. The small, innocuous noises around me, footsteps behind me while I walked, the faint sound of breathing while I was alone, began to grow louder, more insistent. Sometimes I would turn, sure that someone was standing right behind me, but there was nothing. Just empty space. I could feel it, though. The presence. It was there, lurking just out of view. It was the third night after the photo had appeared on my desk when the next call came. This time, it wasn't just a voice. I picked up the phone, expecting the usual chilling tone, but this time it was different. There was a sound. A clicking, mechanical noise, followed by the faintest whisper, "You're almost there." I turned sharply, scanning the room, my heart racing. Something felt off. The air was thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Then, I saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room, near the window. It was tall, too tall, and seemed to move in a way that wasn't quite human. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving nothing but the dim light of the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the floor. The phone line clicked again, and the voice was back. "You've been looking in all the wrong places. But the answers are closer than you think." I stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear. "The truth is closer than you ever imagined," the voice whispered, a cold laugh creeping in behind the words. Then, with a sharp click, the line went dead once more. I stared at the phone, my hands trembling. What truth? What was it that this person wanted from me? And what would happen if I finally gave in and trusted them? A sudden knock on the door echoed through the silence. The knock on the door echoed through the empty room like a thunderclap, so sudden and sharp that I froze in place. My heart thudded in my chest, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had knocked on my door. Not like this. Not so forcefully. I glanced at the phone in my hand. The call had ended. The voice had disappeared. But now, this unexpected knock sounded different. It was deliberate. It was too precise. A chill ran down my spine. I took a hesitant step toward the door, my legs unsteady beneath me. The silence that had followed the phone call was now replaced by the sharp rhythm of my breathing. I could feel the pulse in my temples, beating harder with each passing second. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around the cold metal. Just before I turned it, I hesitated. Should I open it? Should I see who was on the other side? What if it was them? What if the person on the other end of the phone was now standing there, watching me? My mind raced. The knocking continued, but now there was a sense of urgency behind it. Each knock seemed to carry more weight, more pressure. It felt like time was running out. I couldn't stand the suspense any longer. I yanked the door open, but there was no one there. The hallway outside was empty, lit only by the dull glow of the overhead light. Nothing moved. No sign of anyone. I stood there for a long moment, my breath shallow. Had I imagined it? Had the knock been a figment of my paranoid mind? But then, I saw it. On the floor, just outside my doorway, was a small slip of paper. It was folded neatly, almost too neatly, as though someone had placed it there with great care. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the paper. Unfolding it, I saw just 3 words written in bold, almost frantic handwriting. "It's already begun." I felt a cold shiver race through me as I stared at the words. My pulse quickened. The room around me seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as a weight settled in my chest. Had they been watching me? How long had they been watching me? I backed away from the door, the paper still gripped tightly in my hand. The knocking had stopped. The The hallway was once again silent, but the tension in the air remained thick, palpable. What did this mean? What had begun? The voice had warned me. It had promised to help. But with each call, with each encounter, things were only becoming more twisted, more frightening. I needed to get answers. I needed to find out who was behind this and why they were doing this to me. But with every step I took, it felt like the walls were getting higher, the shadows growing longer. The air in the room seemed heavier now, oppressive. I could feel the presence again. It was here, in the room with me. Watching. Waiting. The phone rang again. I nearly dropped it in my haste to pick it up. My hands were slick with sweat. Hello? I breathed into the receiver, trying to steady my voice. There was no answer at first. Just a low, static-filled hum on the other end. And then, softly, barely audible, a voice. "You're too close now," it whispered, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. And it's too late to turn back. I clenched my jaw, trying to push down the panic rising in my throat. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want from me?" The voice didn't respond immediately. But then, as though savoring my fear, it spoke again. "I'm the one who will show you the truth. I'm the one who will make you see. You've been blind for too long. It's time to open your eyes." The line went dead. I stood in the darkening room, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the faint hum of silence that followed. The truth. What truth? What was it that I was supposed to see? I felt a dizzying sense of confusion overwhelm me. The more I tried to understand, the less sense everything made. It was like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. And yet, despite my fear, despite the growing sense that I was losing control, a part of me was almost curious. What was this person trying to show me? What had already begun? And why did it feel like I had no choice but to follow this twisted path they were forcing me onto? I couldn't think straight. The air in the room seemed to pulse with the weight of the unanswered questions. And then, as if in answer to my doubts, the lights flickered. I looked up, heart in my throat. The lights flickered again, this time longer, as though struggling to stay on. And then, in a final burst of light, they went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I could hear my breathing, ragged and loud in the silence. My heart raced, and I felt a tremor run through my body. And then came the sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. No one. But the tapping didn't stop. It was louder now. Closer. And then I heard it. A whisper. "Open your eyes." The tapping stopped. The room was silent again. But I could feel it. Something had shifted. Something had changed. I wasn't alone anymore. The door. The photo. The voice. The knocking. The whispers. It was all connected. But how? The darkness around me felt suffocating, as though it was alive and pressing in from every angle. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, and every sound seemed to be amplified, every creak of the floorboards, every movement of air. The whisper still lingered in my mind, echoing in the silence, "Open your eyes." But how? How could I open my eyes when I didn't even know where to look? I reached out, my hand trembling, brushing against the wall as if trying to ground myself in the familiar. The faintest flicker of light in the distance caught my attention. It was dim, but it was there, an eerie glow seeping under the door to the room next door. Had that light always been there? The tapping from behind me had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was standing just outside my reach. Watching. Waiting for me to make the wrong move. I had to know what was happening. I had to see. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every movement felt like I was walking in slow motion, each footstep a battle against my own instincts, urging me to run, to escape, to get away from whatever this was. I reached the door, the dim light from under it flickering again, casting shadows against the floor. My hand hovered over the handle, but I hesitated. What if I opened it, and everything I thought I knew came crashing down? What if I opened it, and the truth was worse than I could imagine? I swallowed hard, fighting the nausea rising in my throat, and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small room I didn't recognize. It was empty, save for an old wooden table in the center, a single lamp flickering weakly above it. But it wasn't the room that made my stomach churn, it was what was on the table. A photo. It was me. I didn't know it had been taken, but there I was, standing outside my apartment, just as I had the day before. The same clothes, the same expression, but something was different. Something about the photo made my heart skip a beat. The angle, the lighting, it wasn't taken by anyone I knew. I picked it up, my fingers numb. The edges of the photo were worn, as though it had been handled countless times. But what really caught my attention was the back of the photo, scrawled with the same hurried handwriting. "You're still looking in the wrong place." The words seemed to blur in front of me, like a message I was too afraid to fully understand. My mind raced, scrambling to piece everything together. The voice, the knocking, the photo, it was all connected. But how? I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was behind me. I turned around sharply, expecting to see something. But the room was empty. No one there. Yet, the air felt thick with the presence of something watching me. Then, a sudden noise snapped me back to the moment, the unmistakable sound of my phone ringing again. My pulse spiked as I grabbed it from the table. The screen was cracked, a jagged line running through the middle. But the name on the caller ID was the one that made my blood run cold. Unknown. The same number. The same voice. I took a deep breath and answered. "This is getting out of hand," I said, my voice shaking, but I couldn't let them hear the fear. "What do you want from me? Who are you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, as though the person was considering how to respond. Then, the voice came through, low and menacing. "You've already seen too much," it said. "But now, there's no turning back. The game has begun." The words hung in the air, suffocating me. "The game?" I asked, my throat tight. "You're the player now. You always have been." I could feel my grip on the phone slip, my hand trembling violently. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, the weight of the words pressing in on me. The voice chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You've been blind for so long. But now, it's time to open your eyes." The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still clutched tightly in my hand. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears. My vision blurred as I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The photo on the table, was it a clue? A message? I didn't know anymore. I was drowning in confusion, and every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into this twisted game. I needed to make a choice. But which way? I looked at the photo again, my eyes narrowing on the words scrawled across the back. You're still looking in the wrong place. Was I? I needed to think. I needed to find answers. But the walls seemed to be closing in, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. And then, there it was again, the tapping. Louder this time. From the other room. Without thinking, I rushed toward it, my legs moving faster than my brain could process. I couldn't stop myself. The knocking continued, louder and more urgent now, like a countdown. And then I heard it. A voice. So close, I could feel it on the back of my neck. You're too late. I froze. The voice was right there, in the room with me. I spun around, but once again, there was no one there. I was alone. Wasn't I? The knocking stopped. The room fell silent. But now, there was something else. A shadow in the corner of the room, stretching, twisting, as though it were alive. I wasn't sure if I should run or face it. But either way, the game had already begun. The shadow in the corner of the room stretched further, its form growing darker, more distinct, as though it was pulling itself out of the very air around me. I could feel my heart racing, the blood pounding in my ears. I took a slow step back, my body frozen, unsure whether I should run or stay. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. There was something solid about it now. Who's there? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt weak, as if saying them was pointless. The shadow didn't respond, but it seemed to move, as though acknowledging my presence. A chill ran down my spine, the air turning icy. I could see my breath now, the fog from my exhalation thickening the space between me and the figure. Then, a noise. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like nails dragging against the floor. I turned toward the source, but before I could make sense of it, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the shadow. It was a faint whisper, drifting through the air, as if coming from behind me. You're not alone. My body tensed. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if the room had truly changed, if the space around me had somehow shifted, warped into something unrecognizable. It was as if the room itself was closing in, pressing me further into the corner where I had been standing. I could still feel the heavy presence in the room, like a weight on my chest, suffocating me. But every instinct I had screamed at me to face it, to confront whatever this was. I swallowed, trying to steady my breath, and turned my head toward the phone, still lying on the table, its cracked screen dimly lit by the faint glow from the lamp above. I had to get out. I had to call for help. But a strange compulsion kept me rooted to the spot, as though I knew no one would believe me. No one could save me from this. The phone rang again, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. I jumped at the sound, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. I almost didn't want to answer, but the fear of not knowing who was on the other end, what they wanted, was too much to bear. I lifted the phone to my ear, and the voice came immediately, cold and calculated. "Did you think you could run?" it asked, its tone casual but threatening. "Did you think there was anywhere to hide?" I didn't respond. My mind was spinning. Was this real? Was this actually happening? "You're in the game now," the voice continued, its words cutting through the panic rising in my chest. "And there are rules. But you don't know them yet. That's the fun part. My pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice cracking with desperation. The voice paused, as though considering the answer. "I want you to see the truth. All of it. The things you've been ignoring. The things that have been hidden from you. It's all coming for you now." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to push back against the surge of dread that was flooding my body. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't make sense of it. "You can't outrun this," the voice said. "But you can choose how it ends." The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, but the sound of the voice, the words, lingered. They rattled in my mind, leaving a sickening taste in my mouth. The shadow in the corner moved again, this time more deliberately, a dark, creeping shape. It stretched toward me like it had a mind of its own, its form writhing and twisting, taking on the shape of something monstrous. I turned away, fighting the urge to scream. But something inside me knew it was too late. I couldn't run anymore. The door to the room slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the walls, sealing me inside. I was trapped. The room felt colder, and the light from the lamp flickered, casting long, unnerving shadows across the walls. The shadow, if it was a shadow at all, seemed to grow larger, filling the space. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I could hear the whispering again, soft at first, then louder, until it was all around me, a chorus of voices blending into one. "You're still looking in the wrong place." I couldn't see who or what was speaking. I didn't know where it was coming from. It was everywhere, inside my head, in the very walls. The room was closing in around me, and I couldn't stop it. The truth, the game, the rules, it was all converging on me, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. And then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. A cold silence. I dared to look around, but the shadows had completely consumed the room. There was nothing left but darkness. Then, a final sound, footsteps, heavy and deliberate. They came from behind me. The room felt like it was closing in faster, suffocating me. The weight of the darkness pressed against me like an invisible hand. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever I had been running from was about to catch up. I turned, and there it was. A face, pale and lifeless, staring at me from the darkness. The eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto mine. It wasn't a person. It wasn't real. But it was here. And there was no escape. The game had only just begun. Have you ever wondered what happens when the lights go out? The question echoed in my mind as I looked around the museum. It wasn't like any ordinary museum, at least, it hadn't felt like one until now. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and dust, the kind that settles in old places where no one bothers to look for a long time. But tonight was different. Tonight, we were here to prepare for an exhibition. A group of students, all in the same boat, staying overnight to get everything ready for tomorrow. At least, that was the plan. The space was massive, echoing footsteps, tall windows, and the endless rows of art on the walls. My name is Evan. I wasn't particularly excited about the overnight stay, but the idea of getting ahead on the exhibit was enough to push me past the usual discomfort of being trapped in a dark building overnight. My friends, Emily and Jordan, were already setting up some of the displays, their voices muffled by the museum's long corridors. The light was dim but steady, flickering a little too often, like it was just barely holding on. I'd always found museums fascinating. They were full of stories, untold histories frozen in time, waiting to be discovered. But there was something about the air tonight, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt wrong, like a sense of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that we were in an unfamiliar place and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then came the first sound. A creak. It was faint, like the weight of the building shifting. I froze, turning slowly toward the sound, but all I saw was a dark hallway that seemed endless. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling. Old places make strange noises. Emily glanced up from the display she was adjusting, noticing my hesitation. "You okay, Evan?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just, a little tired." Jordan, Eva the skeptic, laughed from across the room. "You've been reading too many horror stories. Relax. It's just a museum." But I didn't feel relaxed. There was a strange tension hanging in the air, like the place itself was holding its breath. We continued to work, but the feeling of unease grew stronger. With each step, I felt more and more disconnected from the world outside. It wasn't the isolation of being in the museum that bothered me, it was the way the building seemed to shift while I wasn't looking. First, the lights flickered again. Then, the walls seemed to breathe. I couldn't quite explain it, but I could feel the pulse of the museum in my chest, as though the building itself was alive. The paintings on the walls? They seemed to stare a little too long. The temperature dropped. Not by much, just a subtle chill in the air that was enough to make me shiver. But it was the sound that made me stop. A whisper. Barely audible at first, as though it was drifting from the other end of the hallway. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe while the others was talking. But when I turned to look, they were all too far away. And then, the whisper came again. Clearer this time. "Leave." I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. The hairs on my arms stood up as the sound of footsteps echoed through the museum, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I turned to Emily, my voice almost a whisper. "Did you hear that?" She looked up from her work, her brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "The whisper. It said leave." Her face softened with concern, but she didn't seem alarmed. Maybe it was just the wind or something, she suggested, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her tone. Jordan chuckled from across the room. "You're overthinking it, man. It's just an old building. Let's finish up here and head out for a drink later, yeah?" But I wasn't convinced. The air was too thick, too heavy with something I couldn't identify. It was as if the museum had shifted, becoming something else entirely. Something darker. I wanted to ask more questions, to dig deeper into this strange feeling, but as I looked around, the walls seemed to move. Not physically, but it was as if the space itself was distorting, bending toward us. The paintings on the walls, they weren't the same. The eyes of the figures in the frames followed me, tracking my every movement. I knew I was being irrational, that it had to be my mind playing tricks. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense that we weren't alone. That something was watching us. Jordan stretched and yawned, his voice cutting through the thick air. "All right, we're almost done here. Let's take a break." As he spoke, the lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't just flicker, they went out completely. The darkness was immediate, engulfing the space in an overwhelming void. My breath caught in my throat as I stood motionless, eyes straining to make out any shapes in the gloom. The faint outline of the paintings, the distant shadows, the creeping sensation of eyes on my back, it was all there, amplifying in the dark. A low hum began to build in the silence. I wanted to call out to my friends to ask if they had noticed the change, but my voice stuck in my throat. The hum grew louder, like a distant chant from somewhere deep within the museum. The walls felt like they were closing in, warping, shifting with unnatural fluidity. Then, the whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Leave, now!" And just like that, the lights flickered back to life. The lights flickered back on, but something had changed. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper. I stood frozen, staring at the museum around me, trying to make sense of what just happened. The hum was gone, but the silence that followed was unbearable. "Evan?" Emily's voice broke through the tension, her figure just a few feet away. She was looking at me, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" I nodded slowly, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. "Yeah, just a weird power surge or something. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. The walls felt too close, like they were pressing in on me. The paintings on the walls still seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every movement, even when I turned away. I couldn't shake the feeling that the museum itself was alive. Jordan was standing near the display tables, his face lit by the dim glow of the overhead lights. "You guys sure you're okay?" "It's just a little darkness. Not like the world's ending or anything." I tried to laugh, but it came out forced, hollow. "Yeah, it's fine." But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The museum, with its vast hallways and empty rooms, felt like a maze now. I couldn't remember if we passed the same place twice, or if the walls had shifted while I wasn't looking. Emily gave me a strange look but didn't press me further. "Let's just finish setting up. We don't want to be here all night." I agreed, though I felt a growing unease as we moved through the corridors, arranging the last of the exhibits. The museum's silence seemed to stretch longer than before, the stillness pressing down on us. Every small sound, footsteps, the faint rustling of paper, felt magnified. Then it happened again. A whisper. Soft, like it was just out of reach. "Leave, now!" This time, I heard it clearly. It wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining it. The voice was real, and it was coming from somewhere deep inside the museum. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to Emily and Jordan, but they didn't seem to hear it. They were busy with their work, their faces focused on the task at hand, unaware of the growing tension around us. I tried to speak, but my voice faltered. Didn't you hear that?" Emily looked up at me, her brow furrowing. "Hear what?" I shook my head, my hands trembling. "Never mind. It's nothing." I couldn't explain it to them. I barely understood it myself. The whisper was real, but what did it mean? Why was it happening? As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, the museum around us began to shift again. The walls seemed to warp, just like before. They stretched out, growing longer, farther apart, then squeezing together in a way that felt unnatural. My stomach churned. "We need to leave," I said, the words coming out more urgently than I meant. Jordan gave me a confused look, brushing off the comment. "Dude, relax. You're freaking out over nothing." But I wasn't relaxing. The sense of being watched intensified. The paintings on the walls, what I had thought were mere images, now looked like they were moving. Figures shifted in the frames, their expressions changing from peaceful to something darker, something more sinister. And then, I saw it. In the corner of my vision, a figure, no, it was a shadow, taller than a person, moved, darting across the far hallway. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. The shadow was there, in the shape of something that shouldn't be. I gasped, my heart racing as I spun to face it, but when I turned, there was nothing. Only the empty hallway. But the feeling of being watched was more intense now, like the very walls were alive with some unseen presence. Evan? Emily's voice was soft, but I could hear the concern in it now. What's going on with you? You're acting strange. I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain the unexplainable? The walls were changing. The shadows were moving. The museum itself was alive, and it was watching us. And then, just as I was about to speak, the whisper came again. Louder this time. Leave. Now. The walls groaned. Something was happening. The museum was shifting, changing, right in front of us. The walls cracked. The floors creaked. It was as though the place itself was alive and waking up. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. Something had gone terribly wrong. The air thickened, pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't escape. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whisper had stopped, but the tension only grew. Every creak, every groan of the building felt like it was a warning, a prelude to something I couldn't comprehend. Evan, come on, Jordan said, his voice low, almost hesitant. He had noticed the change in my demeanor, the way I was looking at the walls like they were closing in on me. We need to get back to work. You're freaking out over nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I felt it deep in my bones. The museum wasn't just a building anymore. It was alive. It was breathing. I swallowed hard, trying to clear the tightness in my throat. I glanced at Emily, who was still setting up the exhibit. She seemed unaware of the oppressive atmosphere. Maybe we should just finish up and leave. Now. This place, it doesn't feel right. But Emily didn't hear the desperation in my voice. She just smiled, brushing her hair behind her ear. It's fine, Evan. It's just your imagination. Let's finish what we came here to do. It's not like we're here forever. She didn't get it. I couldn't explain to her how the building had changed, how everything felt different. The shadows were darker now, thicker. And the paintings, God, the paintings were no longer frozen in time. They had come to life in my mind, their figures twisting, turning, as if they were reaching out from their frames. A sudden bang from down the hall snapped me from my thoughts, and I jumped, my heart racing. What was that? Emily said, her voice tight with alarm. She and Jordan exchanged a nervous glance. I don't know, I whispered, already moving toward the sound. We crept down the corridor, the dim light casting long, distorted shadows. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. A chill ran down my spine. I was sure something was waiting for us. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door that had been closed earlier was now ajar, swinging slowly as if inviting us inside. Do you see that? Jordan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. The door, it wasn't supposed to be open. It couldn't have been. Emily stepped forward cautiously, her eyes wide with unease. Let's just check it out. Maybe it's nothing. But I didn't want to go. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to get out of the museum, but I couldn't. There was something pulling me toward that door. We entered the room together. It was small, filled with strange artifacts, ancient sculptures, jars filled with odd contents, and a large mirror that seemed out of place among the rest of the exhibits. It was covered in dust, as if no one had touched it for years. As soon as we stepped inside, the temperature dropped further. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Look at this," Emily murmured, reaching toward the mirror. "It's like it's not even real. The reflection isn't right." I glanced at the mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. Her reflection was distorted. She was standing in front of it, but the image in the glass, it wasn't hers. It was a pale version, twisted and wrong, her eyes dark and hollow, her mouth curled into a grotesque grin. "Emily, don't touch it," I said urgently, grabbing her arm, pulling her back. "We need to go. Now." But she didn't seem to hear me. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror, as if she was entranced by it. "Emily!" I shouted. She snapped out of her trance, blinking rapidly. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered, her voice shaky. That was terrifying. Jordan, too, was staring at the mirror, his face pale. "This is wrong. We need to get out of here." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate, but not from any of us. My pulse quickened. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. "Let's go," I said, my voice sharp with panic. "We're leaving. Now." We rushed out of the room, but as we turned the corner, everything changed. The walls were where they had been. The hallway was longer, stretching out before us like a twisted, unfamiliar maze. The door we had just entered was no longer in sight. The entire museum had shifted, rearranged itself in a way that defied logic. "What the hell is happening?" Jordan hissed, panic rising in his voice. I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. But the museum was changing, adapting to something, or someone, who was controlling it. And we were trapped. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whatever was stalking us was gaining on us. The paintings, they were moving again. But this time, it wasn't just the figures shifting. The faces, those faces, were staring at us. Their eyes weren't painted anymore. They were real. Alive. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, dragging Emily and Jordan along with me. But no matter how fast we moved, the museum seemed to stretch further, the rooms folding into one another, as if the building was reshaping itself to keep us inside. We were being hunted. And the museum wasn't going to let us leave. We ran blindly through the twisting hallways, our feet pounding on the cold marble floors, but no matter how many turns we took, we seemed to be going in circles. The museum was alive, reshaping itself to trap us within its walls. The exit, the way out, was slipping further away, like a distant dream that we could never quite reach. "Where's the damn door?" Jordan's voice cracked, panic bubbling beneath his words. "We've been running for hours. There has to be a way out." His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving with exhaustion. But there was no time for rest, no time to think. The sounds of footsteps continued to echo through the museum, but now they were joined by something else. Soft whispers, as if the walls themselves were speaking, murmuring words we couldn't understand. I glanced behind us, the darkness pressing in, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure, tall, thin, moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my heartbeat quickened. "Do you see that?" I gasped, pulling at Jordan's sleeve. He whipped around, his face pale. "Where? What is it?" But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of hallway, fading into shadows. It was gone. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "We need to keep moving. We need to find an exit." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That something, someone, was stalking us from the dark corners of this cursed place. We weren't alone. "Emily!" I shouted, turning to her. She was lagging behind, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Emily, come on. We can't stop now." She nodded, but her movements were slow, almost hesitant, like she was dragging herself through thick mud. I reached out to grab her arm, and the moment I touched her skin, I felt it. A cold, unnatural chill. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Her eyes flicked to mine, but they were vacant, empty, as if she was looking through me rather than at me. "Emily, snap out of it!" Jordan yelled, rushing to her side. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from the depths of the museum. It was deep and guttural, like the sound of something ancient and hungry. My stomach twisted in fear, and I pulled Emily away, trying to shake her out of whatever trance she was in. But she didn't respond. Her body was limp, her expression blank. "Evan, we need to get out of here." "Now," Jordan said urgently, grabbing my arm. I could feel the presence behind us now, the one that had been following us. It was getting closer. The air was thick with the scent of something rancid, like rotting flesh, and the temperature had dropped even further, the cold biting into my skin. I heard a door creak open somewhere ahead of us, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. And then, a voice, low and almost melodic, whispered through the dark. "Run." The command was simple, but it filled me with terror. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her along, trying to ignore the way her body felt like a lifeless weight in my hands. She wasn't responding. It was like she wasn't even there anymore. We rounded another corner, but the hallway stretched on infinitely. There was no end, no exit. Just the same oppressive darkness, closing in on us from all sides. Then, in the far distance, I saw something. A flicker of light. A door, cracked open just enough to reveal the faintest glimmer of hope. "Look! There!" I shouted, pointing. Jordan's eyes widened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he ran without hesitation. "Let's go! It's our way out." But as we neared the door, something strange happened. The door wasn't getting any closer. It felt like the more we ran, the farther it seemed to move away, as though the museum itself was pulling us back into its labyrinthine grip. "No," I gasped, desperation rising in my chest. "No, we're getting closer, I swear it." But the door was gone. Vanished. Just like the rest of the museum, it had reconfigured itself, mocking us. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath ragged. My hands were shaking, and the panic was setting in. We were trapped. There was no escape. A low laugh echoed from behind me, soft but sinister. I spun around, but all I saw was the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Something was coming, and we weren't going to make it out. Then, the walls shifted again. The floor beneath our feet seemed to ripple, and the lights flickered. The museum was alive, moving in ways that didn't make sense. It was toying with us, playing a cruel game. And somewhere, deep within the heart of the museum, I could feel it. The presence that had been following us was now closing in. "We need to find Emily," I said through gritted teeth, desperation seeping into my voice. But she was no longer standing next to us. She was gone. We turned frantically, scanning the endless hallways, but she had disappeared, swallowed by the shadows. "Emily!" I screamed. "Where are you?" But the only answer was the faint, echoing sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the distance. We had lost her. And now, we were truly alone. Panic flooded my veins, and my mind raced. Emily was gone, vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the museum. I couldn't let her disappear. I couldn't. "Jordan, we have to find her," I said, my voice shaking, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I grabbed his arm, desperate for him to understand. He looked at me, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's not safe. We need to get out of here, Evan. We need to leave, now." But I couldn't leave her behind. I couldn't let whatever was in this place take her. I yanked my arm from his grasp and turned back into the dark hallway, my steps hurried and reckless. "Evan, stop!" Jordan shouted, but I wasn't listening. I couldn't. I could hear her voice now, faint, almost a whisper. But it was enough. It was her. She was out there. "Emily!" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. "Emily, where are you?" The whispers grew louder. The walls of the museum began to shift again, creaking and groaning as if they were alive, closing in on us, tightening around us, pushing us towards something or someone. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They were getting closer. But they weren't Emily's. They weren't human. I turned around, my heart racing in my chest. The shadows had come to life. I didn't wait. I ran. The walls seemed to close in behind me, suffocating me with their weight. I could feel something, no, someone, breathing down my neck. I turned the corner sharply, almost stumbling, and my eyes widened. There, in front of me, was Emily. She was standing in the center of the hallway, her back to me, her body stiff, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her head tilted slightly to one side, her hair cascading over her face. "Emily?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't move. Didn't respond. "Emily!" I called again, louder this time. But she remained still, her body unmoving. Her silence was deafening. I took a step forward, then another, my legs shaking. Something wasn't right. She was too still, too unnatural. As I approached, I felt it again, the unmistakable presence, the thing that had been lurking in the dark corners of the museum. The air grew colder. The floor beneath me felt slick, like ice. I reached out, my hand trembling, and when my fingers brushed against her shoulder, she turned. Her eyes were wide, empty, black voids. There was no recognition, no warmth, just a deep, unending darkness that pulled me in. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not hers. "You should never have come here," the voice hissed, low and cold. Before I could react, she reached out, grabbing my arm with an unnatural strength. It was as if her fingers had turned to ice, her grip tight, suffocating. "Let go of me!" I screamed, struggling to break free. But the more I fought, the tighter her grip became. And then I felt it, the cold creeping into my skin, numbing my muscles, freezing my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed. Suddenly, the walls of the museum shifted again, and the world around me seemed to warp. The ground cracked open beneath me, and I stumbled, falling into the void. I landed hard on the cold, uneven stone floor. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my heart hammering in my ears. I looked up. The museum was gone. I was no longer in the familiar hallways, no longer surrounded by the strange, shifting shadows. I was in a room I had never seen before, an endless, dark abyss. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel something watching me. Something waiting. "Jordan?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. There was no answer. The silence was absolute. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs weak, my body trembling. I had to find him. I had to find Emily. But the shadows around me were closing in, wrapping themselves around me like a suffocating blanket. I heard a noise. A creak. A shuffle. And then, the sound of heavy breathing. It was behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. Endless darkness. And then, a shape began to emerge from the blackness. It was tall, too tall, its form stretching unnaturally. The shadows clung to it, like it was one with the darkness itself. I couldn't make out its features, only the shifting, monstrous silhouette. The air grew heavier, thicker, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. The shadows pressed in closer, and I could feel the weight of whatever was coming for me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to escape. All I knew was that the museum had won. The walls had closed in, and there was no way out. What if your nightmares weren't just dreams? What if they were real? It started innocently enough. The first time, I didn't even think much of it. Just a typical nightmare, like the ones I had before. I was in a dark room, and I could hear something breathing, something large, something alive. I couldn't move. My legs were heavy, my chest tight, my breath shallow and panicked. Then it happened. The floor cracked open beneath me, a sharp, jagged chasm that swallowed me whole. I fell, falling deeper and deeper into the void, and I could feel the darkness close in. My heart raced as I screamed, but no sound escaped. And then, just as the blackness consumed me entirely, I woke up. I was in my bed. Safe. My heart still pounding, but I was awake. I told myself it was just a dream, nothing more. A passing nightmare. But the next night, it came again. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. A bad dream. But this time, the details were sharper, clearer. The room was the same, dark, suffocating. The same weight on my chest, the same crushing silence. The only difference was that this time, I could hear footsteps. Heavy, slow steps, dragging closer and closer, echoing through the hollow space. I turned, but there was no one there. Then, the floor cracked open once again. My heart thudded as I fell, falling into that suffocating black void, the same fear gripping me. I woke up. But this time, something was different. My bed felt unfamiliar. The room was strange. The air was heavier, thick with something I couldn't place. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to adjust. It took a moment for the fog in my mind to clear, and then I realized I wasn't in my room. I wasn't in my house. I was in the same place. The same dark room, the same suffocating space. I froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't possible. This had to be a dream, right? But as the footsteps grew louder, closer, I realized, no, this was real. My heart stopped. My body went cold. I tried to move, but I was frozen. Every muscle in my body refused to obey. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. Tall, impossible, stretching unnaturally. It moved slowly, like it was savoring my fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadow grew larger, its shape more defined. Its eyes, two burning, empty orbs, locked onto mine. I felt the weight of its gaze, cold and unfeeling. The air became thick with dread. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The darkness was alive now, moving, twisting, wrapping around me. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Then it reached for me. And just as its fingers grazed my skin, I woke up. Again. I sat straight up in bed, gasping for air. My hands trembled. My chest felt tight, my heart thumping in my chest like it was going to break free. But this time, there was no relief. No comfort in knowing it was just a nightmare. Because I was still here. In my room. But was it really my room? The walls felt off. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, and when I glanced at the clock, it was almost identical to the time I had fallen asleep. No, this couldn't be real. I got out of bed, my mind spinning. This was crazy. But it felt so real. And that's when I heard it. A noise, faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I turned toward the door, but there was no one there. Just the dark hallway outside, stretching endlessly, just like in my dream. And then I realized I wasn't awake. The nightmare had begun again. And this time, I wasn't sure how to escape. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if the very walls of my room were closing in on me. I wanted to run, but where? There was no escape. The door in front of me didn't lead anywhere. I knew that. I looked around desperately, searching for something, anything, that could make sense of this nightmare. But the room, the hallway outside, the very air itself, all of it felt wrong. Familiar, but twisted. The walls pulsed like they were alive, breathing in rhythm with my panic. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching out like fingers, crawling along the floor, up the walls, as if they were waiting for me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this real? Or was I still in the dream? It didn't matter, did it? The terror was the same either way. And then, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. My own breath caught in my throat as I strained my ears for any sign of movement. Nothing. I took a cautious step forward. Another. Then, a voice. A whisper, faint at first, but unmistakable. "Come closer." I froze. My blood ran cold. I couldn't see anyone. There was no one in the hallway. The room around me was empty. And yet, the voice had been real. I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't just a part of the dream. It was here. With me. The whisper echoed in my ears again, louder this time. "Come closer." A chill ran down my spine. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move, inching toward the door. I didn't know why. Something inside me told me I had to open it, that I needed to see what was on the other side, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. But as soon as my hand touched it, the door swung open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me. A gust of cold air rushed past me, the scent of something decayed and musty filling my lungs. Beyond the door, there was nothing but darkness. And then, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shape in the blackness. But as I stepped forward, the darkness parted, revealing a woman. Her back was to me, and she stood perfectly still, as if waiting for me to approach. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in tangled waves, and her clothes were torn, as though she'd been through something horrific. The air around her shimmered, distorting, like a mirage. I wanted to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Then, the woman turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw her face. It was gaunt, hollowed out, as if all the life had been drained from her. Her skin was pale, stretched too tightly over her bones, and her eyes were wide open, but empty. There was nothing behind them, just blackness, like two endless voids. She smiled. A cold, cruel smile. And before I could react, the floor cracked open beneath me again. I fell, falling into the same void, the same blackness that swallowed me every time. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I tried to fight, to grasp at something, anything, but there was nothing. Only the endless fall. The woman's hollow smile burned into my mind, and the whisper, her voice, echoed in my ears. "Come closer." And then, I woke up. I gasped for air, my body trembling. I was back in my bed. But everything felt off. The same disorienting weight in the air. The same quiet that felt too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I looked around, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It was just a dream, right? But no! The room was the same. The same oppressive silence. The same shadows that seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the bed, the woman stood there, watching me. Her eyes. Those empty, hollow eyes. I could feel her gaze, cold and unfeeling. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. She was here. In my room. And I wasn't sure if I was awake anymore. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. I had to have imagined it. But then I saw her again. Her silhouette was darker than the shadows around her, like she was made from the darkness itself. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching me with those empty, endless eyes. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat like a hammer against my ribs. The room felt smaller, suffocating. I tried to turn away, to look anywhere but at her, but my body was frozen, unable to obey my desperate pleas. My breath came in shallow gasps, but it sounded too loud in the oppressive quiet. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped my throat. It was as if the very air around me had been stolen, replaced with an oppressive weight that kept me locked in place. My hands trembled, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. It was as if some invisible force held me there. Then, a soft rustling sound broke the silence, and my gaze snapped to the bed. The blankets, my blankets, were moving. Slowly at first, like something was crawling beneath them, pushing them up as if something was shifting underneath. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The rustling stopped, and the room fell into an even deeper stillness. But I could feel it now. The presence of something else. Something not just in the room, but inside my mind. The woman didn't move, but her eyes, they never left me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to escape. I pushed myself up from the bed, my legs unsteady, and I bolted for the door. My hand shook violently as I reached for the doorknob, and it felt like an eternity before I managed to twist it. But as I opened the door, the hallway outside wasn't the same. It was darker. The walls seemed to stretch, bending and warping. The air smelled wrong, stale, almost metallic. It felt as though the entire house had shifted while I was trapped in that room. I stepped out, my bare feet silent on the cold, uneven floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pulling at me from the shadows, dragging me deeper into whatever this nightmare had become. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of me, and the door behind me slammed shut on its own. I turned quickly, but there was no door. Just a blank wall. No way out. I turned back around, and that's when I saw her again. The woman. She was at the end of the hallway now, standing at the farthest point of the stretch of dark, just before the blackness swallowed her entirely. She was no longer still, but moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall was unnervingly soft, yet each step echoed in the silence. Her smile widened. I felt my stomach twist, panic rising in my throat. She wasn't real. She couldn't be. This had to be another part of the dream. But even as the thought flickered in my mind, I knew deep down that this wasn't just a dream anymore. It was something else. Something that followed me. I backed away, my feet stumbling, but the hallway seemed to stretch with every step I took. No matter how far I moved, she got closer, her smile widening with each step. She wasn't walking anymore, she was gliding, floating toward me like a shadow in the dark. I couldn't stop. I couldn't escape. My mind was screaming for me to run, but my body wasn't responding. Come closer, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't in my ears. It was inside my head, as if her voice was speaking directly into my thoughts. I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. I was trapped. Trapped in this endless nightmare. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. The hallway plunged into darkness. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. And then the whispers started. Not just one, but dozens of voices, all speaking in unison. Come closer. Come closer. Come closer. I turned in every direction, but there was nothing. No escape. No way out. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and I felt something cold grip my wrist. I screamed, but no sound came out. The grip on my wrist tightened, cold fingers digging into my skin. I tried to yank my arm free, but the force pulling me was too strong. It wasn't just my wrist, it was as if something was pulling me from the very core of my being, dragging me deeper into the darkness. I stumbled backward, but the shadows seemed to stretch out and swallow the light. Every direction I looked felt wrong, unfamiliar, like the hallway itself was shifting, its walls contorting and growing taller, then smaller, as though mocking my every attempt to escape. The whispers were all around me now, thick and suffocating, and they felt like they were coming from inside my own head. Closer, they hissed, closer, you're almost there. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices, but even that didn't help. It felt like the entire space was alive with sound, scraping, rustling, the eerie shuffle of something moving just out of sight. Every inch of the darkness around me seemed to be pulsing, like it was breathing, waiting for me to make a move. And then I felt it. A presence, not far behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was her, the woman. Her breath was warm on the back of my neck, her presence hanging like a thick fog. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. And then, silence. The whispers stopped. The cold grip on my wrist loosened. I dared to open my eyes, and the hallway around me had changed. It wasn't just distorted, it had twisted. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all of it was moving, growing, shifting into a new shape. The space felt even larger, more oppressive. I was standing in the middle of some impossible maze that had no end, no direction. My footsteps echoed like I was walking on glass, and every corner seemed to lead to nowhere. And then, a single sound broke through the silence. A soft, hollow laugh. A laugh that was familiar. It was hers. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I forced myself to run. I bolted down the corridor, the sound of my own footsteps loud and frantic in the oppressive stillness. I had to get away. I had to get out. But the walls, they were closing in. The hallway seemed to stretch and contract like it was alive, forcing me into a smaller, tighter space with every step. The pressure in the air was suffocating, the weight of something unseen pressing down on my chest. And then, at the far end of the hallway, I saw it. A door. A single, wooden door, cracked slightly open, as though it had been waiting for me. I rushed toward it, heart pounding in my throat. The door was so close. It felt real. I was almost there. I reached for the handle, but as my fingers brushed it, the door slammed shut in front of me with a deafening bang. I gasped, stumbling backward. It was happening again. I wasn't waking up. This wasn't a dream. I turned around, and she was standing there, just a few feet away. The woman. Her face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel her eyes on me. Cold. Unblinking. Watching me. Her smile was stretched wide, impossibly wide, a grotesque mockery of something human. No. No. I shouted, my voice trembling with panic. I could feel the tears in my eyes now, the desperation taking over. Please, please, just let me go. This isn't real. This can't be real. She didn't speak, but I could hear her in my head. In my very thoughts. It is real, she whispered, her voice smooth, like velvet on broken glass. And it's never going to stop. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway had closed in completely. The walls were so close now I could feel them closing in on me, and the air was so thick it was like I was suffocating. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, but something far worse. It was coming from the floor beneath me. Something was stirring in the darkness. The shadows on the ground began to shift, twisting, reaching out for me. They were like hands, cold, skeletal hands that stretched from the floor, trying to grab me, to pull me under. I screamed and stumbled backward, but my feet caught on something, and I fell. I fell into darkness. And when I landed, I wasn't alone. The woman stood over me, her face inches from mine. She was smiling again. But this time, her smile was twisted, her lips pulled back so far that I could see her teeth, sharp and jagged. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Her hand reached down, brushing my cheek with a touch colder than ice. The shadows around me closed in, and then everything went dark. I woke up, but something was wrong. The air felt too thick, as if I was breathing through a damp cloth. My chest felt heavy, like a weight was pressing down on me. And there was an odd scent, stale, like old, decaying wood. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The room, it wasn't my room. It wasn't even the hallway anymore. The walls around me were cracked, peeling, covered in layers of dust and neglect. The ceiling was low, and a flickering light bulb hung by a thin thread, casting erratic shadows across the space. I stood, trembling, but as soon as my feet touched the ground, the sensation of being watched hit me again. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. But the feeling, the presence, was still there. I wasn't alone in this room. I could hear something breathing, something watching me. I closed my eyes and gritted my teeth. I had to stay calm. I had to get out. I stumbled to the door, my fingers fumbling over the rusted handle. When I finally managed to turn it, the door opened with a creak, but what lay on the other side wasn't any better. It was the same hallway. The same oppressive darkness that had been chasing me. I felt my chest tighten again. Panic was starting to crawl up my spine. The walls were closer now. The ceiling seemed to hang lower. Everything around me was breathing, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The whispers started again. Closer, they beckoned. Closer. I turned and ran, my footsteps loud in the silent, suffocating air. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just had to escape. As I ran, the shadows stretched out in front of me, and I realized, too late, that they were moving toward me. They weren't just shadows. They were something else, something with substance, something with claws that scraped against the walls as they followed my every step. I reached the end of the hallway and saw the door again. The same wooden door. It was ajar, just like before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about it. I pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The room beyond was dark, but it felt different. It was colder. No light. No warmth. Just blackness, suffocating and thick, as though the very air was alive, closing in around me. And then, there she was. The woman. Her face was illuminated in the faint, flickering light from the hallway. Her eyes, empty and hollow, were fixed on me. Her smile was wide, grotesque. And her hand, oh God, her hand was reaching toward me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body paralyzed by terror. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice echoing in my skull. "You'll always be here." Her hand touched my face, and it was cold. So cold. Colder than anything I'd ever felt. I closed my eyes, and for a brief moment, the world felt like it was spinning out of control. I was back. Back in the same nightmare. But then I realized this wasn't the same. It wasn't just a dream. It was real. Her fingers dug into my skin, and I felt the cold, sharp pain shoot through me. I gasped, but no sound came out. I tried to pull away, but it was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was trapped. She leaned in closer, her breath icy on my ear. "You'll never wake up. Not again." And then everything went black. It started with a feeling, a strange sensation that crept into my mind like a quiet whisper. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, just the result of too much stress, too many sleepless nights. But it didn't go away. It followed me. And it grew. Some days, it felt as though I was living two lives at once. In one, everything was fine. My apartment was neat and tidy, the warm glow of sunlight filtered through the curtains, and I was able to enjoy the simplest of pleasures, a cup of coffee in the morning, a chat with a friend on the phone, the hum of life outside my window. It was peaceful, comfortable, normal. But then there were the other days when everything was wrong. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my breath shallow, my heart racing, as if I had been running for miles. The air felt different, thick, stagnant, as though it carried a heaviness I couldn't shake. The apartment would look the same, but there was something off about it. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the silence was so deep it felt like it was swallowing everything. And that's when I noticed it. The first time, it was a shadow in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a figment of my tired mind. But when I blinked, it didn't disappear. It stayed. And then it moved. Just a flicker of something unnatural. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought, but my body was tense, as if it were bracing itself for something that hadn't yet happened. I turned away, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it didn't end there. As the days passed, I found myself caught in the middle of these two worlds. In one, I was the person I had always been, confident, calm, in control. In the other, I was a prisoner of my own mind, trapped in a place where nothing made sense. The floor beneath my feet would sometimes feel soft, as if I were walking on sand, while at other times it would feel as though the very air was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I would wake up in one world, and the next moment I would find myself somewhere else entirely. The streets outside my window, the ones I knew so well, would be twisted, unfamiliar. The people I passed in the hallways would look at me with strange expressions, as if they knew something I didn't. I tried to talk to people, tried to explain, but every word felt like it was slipping away from me, lost in the haze of confusion. They would smile at me, their faces blank, as if they couldn't hear the fear in my voice. The worst part? Every time I tried to go back, to return to my life as it had been, I found myself slipping deeper into this alternate reality where everything was broken, distorted, and cold. The sounds, too, were different. The silence, once so comforting, now felt like a constant presence, pressing on me, suffocating me. and the noises I couldn't quite place, faint footsteps behind me, a door creaking when no one was there, tugged at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something, or someone, was waiting for me to acknowledge it. Each time I closed my eyes, the line between the two worlds blurred. I would dream of one, only to wake up in the other. The transitions became harder to distinguish, the switch from one reality to the next becoming less and less noticeable. Was this a dream? A nightmare that I couldn't wake up from? Or was I truly caught between two realities, both of them pulling me in different directions? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But one thing was clear, I was losing control. And every time I tried to fight it, to force myself back into the familiar, I felt myself slipping further into this new world. A world that didn't feel like mine, a world that was unfamiliar, hostile. I didn't want to believe it. But I was starting to wonder, what if there was no escape? I looked around, half expecting to see the shadow again, the one that moved when I wasn't watching. I held my breath, listening for any sound that wasn't mine. The air felt colder now, and the once comfortable silence was suffocating. And then, I heard it, a soft scrape, followed by a click. A sound I didn't recognize. It came from behind me. I turned around, my heart thudding in my chest. Nothing was there. But the feeling, the presence, it lingered. Something was watching me. Waiting. I backed away, my pulse quickening. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way back to the life I knew. But every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the other world. A world that felt wrong, broken. And then, I saw it. The shadow. Only now, it was clearer. More defined. More real. It was moving toward me. I froze, my heart in my throat. The shadow shifted, twisting and contorting as if it were made of smoke, of something inhuman. It came closer, its shape growing sharper, more distinct. I could see the outline of a figure, but I couldn't make out its face. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the room, it was different now. The light had dimmed. The walls were closer. The air felt thicker, colder. I wasn't in the same place anymore. I had crossed over, and there was no way back. I woke up gasping for air, my hands clutching at the bed sheets, my body drenched in sweat. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still in that other world. The one that felt like it was closing in on me, where shadows moved and the air was thick with something I couldn't define. But the familiar hum of my apartment's air conditioner pulled me back to reality. The soft light from the morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting gentle shadows across the room. Everything was normal, ordinary. It should have been a relief. Except it wasn't. I sat up, my heart still racing, my pulse hammering in my chest. I was back. Or at least, I thought I was. But something felt off. I looked around the room, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. The walls, the furniture, they all looked the same. Nothing had changed. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The shadow. That figure I had seen, it wasn't just a nightmare. I knew it now. It was real. I couldn't explain how, but I could feel it lingering at the edges of my mind. And worse, I could feel it watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I pushed the thought aside, trying to focus on anything else. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, hoping that the normality of checking my messages would ground me. But when I unlocked it, my stomach twisted. There was a new message from a number I didn't recognize. The message was short, cryptic, and chilling. "I see you." My hand trembled as I dropped the phone back onto the bed. My breath hitched to my throat. Was this another part of the dream? Another layer to the world I had been pulled into? Or was this real? I couldn't tell anymore. I stood up shakily, trying to force myself to move. I needed to get out of the apartment, away from these suffocating walls. I needed to breathe. I needed to remind myself that everything was fine, that this was just a bad dream and I was waking up from it. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I felt it. The change in the air. It was subtle at first, just a strange heaviness, a shift in the familiar hum of the building. But then it hit me like a wave, making me freeze in place. The world around me seemed to warp. The hallway, once comforting in its monotony, now felt cold. The walls seemed to lean in, and the ceiling, which had always been a dull, off-white, now looked too low, too oppressive. The air was thick, cloying, as though I were breathing in something foreign, something wrong. I turned to look back, half expecting to see the apartment I had just left. But it wasn't there. The door to my apartment had vanished. The space behind me was empty, stretching out into an endless, dark void. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. There had to be a way back. I had to get back to the life I knew. But every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into this distorted world. It was happening again. I could feel my breath quicken as I stumbled forward, trying to find a door, an exit, anything. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls twisting and shifting as though they were alive. The lights overhead flickered, casting strange, fleeting shadows across the floor. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, like footsteps. Soft, but growing louder with each passing second. I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I strained my ears, listening for any other sound. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the unsettling silence in their wake. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps had been real. I stumbled forward again, faster now, the sound of my own breathing filling my ears. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever was waiting for me caught up. But then the hallway shifted again. The walls seemed to pulse, as if breathing with me, and I felt my stomach lurch. The door at the end of the hallway that I had been walking toward, one I was certain hadn't been there moments ago, now looked wrong. The wood was warped, its edges jagged, as if something had torn it apart. I was drawn toward it, an invisible pull tugging at me. My feet moved of their own accord, and I felt the overwhelming urge to open it, to see what lay beyond. With shaking hands, I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, like ice, and as I turned it, the door creaked open slowly. I stepped through. The room on the other side was a mirror of my apartment, but twisted. The furniture was all there, the same arrangement of chairs, the same paintings on the walls, but everything was wrong. The air felt colder, and the colors were muted, like a faded photograph. I didn't understand. This was my apartment, wasn't it? I walked in, my heart thumping in my chest. Everything seemed to be slightly out of place. The couch was tilted, the lamp on the side table flickered strangely, and there was a faint, lingering smell of something rotten in the air. The light from the windows was dim, as if the sun was obscured by something heavy outside. I looked toward the hallway. I didn't want to go back out there, but I had no choice. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. They were coming toward me. My heart raced. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had to wake up. But I didn't. I wasn't sure if I ever would. I turned toward the door, but before I could move, the shadow appeared again. The same twisted, unnatural shape that had followed me before. It stepped into the room. And this time, I couldn't deny it. This wasn't a dream. It was real. I froze. The shadow had become more than just an outline. It was real. It was standing in the doorway, a dark, featureless figure. The dim light from the room cast strange, long shadows across its form, distorting it even further. I couldn't see its face. There was no face. Just darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, my hands scraping against the wall. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. The air had become thick, oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. My chest tightened with each labored breath. The figure in the doorway didn't move. It just stood there, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. It didn't have to move. I could feel its eyes, though I knew it didn't have any. I could feel them boring into me, the weight of its gaze pulling me in. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding louder than the silence. This was it, wasn't it? This was what had been following me. This was what I had been running from. But I didn't run. I couldn't. Something inside me, some force, kept me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head slightly, the movement so slow, so deliberate, that it made my skin crawl. It was studying me, as if I were some kind of specimen. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then, it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice, it was a low, echoing hum that seemed to vibrate through my skull. I felt it in my bones, deep in my chest. Why do you resist? The question hit me like a wave. My mind reeled, scrambling for an answer I didn't have. Why? Why did I resist? What was it even asking me? I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, as though something had taken root inside me, choking my words before they could escape. You can never escape, the voice hummed, again and again, the words twisting and contorting in my mind. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I wanted to look away, to turn and flee, but I couldn't. The shadow held me captive. I wanted to fight, to do something, anything, but I didn't know how. It was like my body had forgotten how to act. I had no control. The room around me started to distort again, like it was folding in on itself. The edges of the walls curled, the furniture began to bend and twist, and the floor seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as my heart. The figure didn't move, didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to manipulate reality. My reality. You cannot return. This is your world now, the voice reverberated, each word sinking deeper into my skull. My mind screamed for escape, for some way to break free from this nightmare. But the more I resisted, the more the world around me twisted, contorted into shapes I couldn't recognize. I turned away, stumbling toward the window, hoping that the real world, my world, was still out there. But when I reached it, when I looked outside, I saw only blackness. Nothing. Just an empty void. No sky, no streets, no people. I was alone. My stomach churned as I realized the truth. There was no escape. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I wasn't even in the world I had known. I had crossed into a place where nothing was real, where nothing made sense. And I couldn't find my way out. You will learn, the shadow hummed, its voice growing louder, more insistent. You will learn to accept this reality. It's the only one that's real. I wanted to scream, to protest, but my voice failed me. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. I was drowning in the pressure of it all, the pressure of being trapped in a world that wasn't mine, a world that wasn't real. The shadow stepped forward then, its form shifting, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. It reached out toward me, its hand, or what seemed like a hand, stretching toward my face. Its fingers, long and twisted, hovered inches from my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just before it touched me, everything stopped. The air was still. The world was still. I opened my eyes and looked around. I was back. Back in my apartment. The familiar sight of my living room, the soft light filtering through the blinds, it was all there. Everything was as it should be. But was it? I looked around, my heart racing. The room felt wrong. The edges of the furniture were sharper, the shadows darker. The silence was deafening. I turned to the window again. It was still night outside. The streetlights flickered weakly in the distance, but there was something else. Something moving. I strained my eyes, trying to see better, but it was too far away. A shadow. No, not just a shadow. It was the same figure. Standing across the street, watching me. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't over. I had returned, yes, but something had followed me. And now, I had no idea if I was still in the same world, or if I had ever truly left. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure across the street, its outline flickering in the dim light, wasn't just a shadow. It was real. Or was it? My mind spun as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I still in the real world? Or had I slipped back into that nightmare? I backed away from the window, my pulse thundering in my ears. My legs felt weak, as though they were made of stone, refusing to carry me. I could still feel the oppressive weight of that presence, the sense that I was being watched, even when I closed my eyes. I stood there, frozen. The seconds stretched into eternity. Every sound around me felt amplified, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of cars passing on the street. But there was a low, unsettling noise beneath it all. Like a whisper, so faint it could have been a trick of my mind. "You're not safe," the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't just in my head. It was in the room. Close. Too close. I whipped around, my heart racing, searching the room for the source. Nothing. The room was as still as it had been before. But I knew, I felt it deep within me, something was wrong. Something had shifted. I staggered backward, bumping into the couch. My hands reached out, grasping at anything to steady myself. I could feel the floor beneath me tremble, as though the very foundation of my apartment was alive, shifting. The whisper grew louder. "You can't hide from me." I turned again, but this time the shadow was gone. The figure that had been watching me was no longer across the street. It was inside. I could feel it now, creeping in from every corner of the room. It was in the walls, in the air, in the space between the flickering lights. The shadows seemed to thicken, to stretch unnaturally, as though the room itself was closing in. "Why do you fight it?" the voice echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull. "You can't escape. You never could." I stumbled toward the door, desperate to get out. I yanked the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I pulled harder, my hands slipping, my chest tight with panic. The walls seemed to press in on me, as if the room itself was holding me captive. The whisper became a chant, a rhythmic, haunting sound that filled my head. "You belong here." The words burrowed deep into my thoughts. I shook my head, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. The more I resisted, the louder they became. The room seemed to pulse with them, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs, breathing in sync with the tormenting hum. I glanced back at the window. The figure was there again, standing at the edge of the street, watching. No, there were more now. Figures. Shapes. Moving in the darkness. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel them, their presence seeping into the room. I turned back to the door. It had to open. I had to leave. But as I tugged the handle once more, I felt it, a cold, icy grip on my wrist. The pressure was suffocating. A hand, no, more like claws, wrapped around my arm. I could feel the coldness seeping into my skin, like it was draining the warmth from my bones. I looked down, but there was nothing there. The shadow had no form, no shape, it was just an overwhelming presence, pulling me into its grasp. "You belong here," the voice repeated, now almost a growl. "You can never escape." My heart was racing, my body shaking uncontrollably. My vision blurred as I gasped for air. The room spun, disorienting me, the walls seemed to melt and distort, like they were made of liquid. But then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The grip on my wrist loosened. The room stilled. I was standing in the same place, the same room. It looked the same, but it felt different. The air was thick with something unfamiliar, something I couldn't name. I breathed heavily, my chest rising and falling. I took a tentative step back from the door, my legs still unsteady. I glanced around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. No figures, no shadows. But there was a faint scent in the air. Something metallic. Something wrong. And then I saw it. The mirror on the wall, one that I had never noticed before, was reflecting something that wasn't there. It wasn't my own reflection, but a distorted version of the room. It was a different version of my apartment. Broken. Shattered. The walls were cracked, the furniture overturned. There was no light, only darkness in the reflection. But there, standing in the center of the room, was the figure. It was smiling. Not in any way a human smile. It was twisted, grotesque, a grin too wide for a face, with sharp teeth glinting in the dimness. And its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow everything in their gaze. I turned away from the mirror, my stomach churning. I had to leave. I had to get out. But the door was still locked. I tried again. And again. But it wouldn't open. I was trapped. And somewhere, In the dark corners of my mind, I knew I would never escape. I was no longer sure if I was standing in my apartment or if it had somehow transformed into something else. The air felt colder now, like it was pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. My hands, trembling, searched for the door again. I couldn't tell if I was still trying to escape or if I was looking for something that might help me understand what had happened. The mirror. The reflection in the mirror. It haunted me. I couldn't stop seeing that twisted smile, those black, hollow eyes. I turned back to look at it again, against my better judgment. The figure was still there. But this time, it moved. Slowly. Unnaturally. The reflection of its twisted form flickered like a broken television screen. "You can't outrun me," the voice whispered again, but it didn't feel like it was just in my head anymore. It was all around me, seeping into my skin, crawling under my bones. I stepped back, my heart pounding, but my feet didn't seem to obey me. I tried to turn away from the mirror, but the image, no, the nightmare, held me there. I was frozen in place, trapped in a vision that wasn't real, but felt more real than anything else. I could feel it now, that pressure in the air, like something was watching me from every direction, pressing on me. I was no longer sure if the room was real. Or was I the one who had become unreal? I couldn't trust my own senses. The sound of my breathing filled the silence, but it didn't feel like it was coming from me. Snap. The sudden, sharp noise made me flinch. I turned toward it, and for a brief second, I saw movement, something shifting in the corner of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. Just shadows. My mind screamed, telling me to run. But where? Where could I go? Everything had already become foreign, and no matter how fast I moved, I was always one step behind, trapped in a loop I couldn't escape. "You belong to me," the voice echoed, now everywhere, filling my thoughts until they were no longer my own. It wrapped itself around my mind, tightening like a vice. My hands reached for my phone instinctively, but when I glanced down at the screen, I saw only static. The usual lock screen was replaced with an image of the reflection, the same distorted version of my room, with the figure still standing there, watching. No. No, no, no. I dropped the phone. I felt dizzy. The floor tilted beneath me. I pressed my palm against the wall to steady myself, but the wall didn't feel solid. It was soft, like it was made of something other than wood and plaster. It seemed to pulse, breathing in time with the air, like it was alive. I staggered backward. Was this real? Or had I slipped completely into that other place? The darkness in the corners of the room deepened, as if something was closing in, and I felt its weight pressing down on me. The figure in the mirror wasn't just watching me anymore. It was moving toward me, slowly at first, then faster. I backed into the window. The glass felt cold against my skin, too cold, like it wasn't glass at all but some other surface I couldn't name. It reached out. The figure's hand, no, its claw, was pressed against the mirror, reaching toward me with an unnatural speed. I screamed, turning away from the window, trying to find the door again, trying to get out, but there was nothing. The walls were closing in. The room seemed to stretch in every direction, pulling me in, pulling me toward the reflection. My heart was in my throat. My breath caught. The figure was right there, standing behind me now, its presence suffocating. I could feel the coldness of its breath on my neck, though I didn't dare to look. And then, in a voice that was more of a growl than anything else, it said, "You're mine." I froze. My mind screamed in protest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The floor shifted beneath me again, and suddenly, the room wasn't just twisting. It was breaking apart. The walls cracked, the ceiling split open. The world around me fell into pieces, like shattered glass. And then I saw it, the dark void that stretched beyond the room, beyond everything. It was nothingness, empty and endless, waiting to swallow me whole. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I tried to call out, to ask for help, but no sound escaped. Everything had become a blur, a vortex of broken images and sounds, too twisted to comprehend. And then I felt it. A hand. Cold. Firm. It grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the darkness. I looked down. My own hand, no, it wasn't mine. It was a shadow, a broken thing, like a faded memory. The last thing I saw before I was pulled into the void was the reflection in the shattered mirror. The figure smiled, its hollow eyes filled with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but something far worse. The last thing I heard, before everything went black, was its voice, whispering one final time, "You will never escape." This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.